With one bound, Tex was free. By Ronnie Quest. Copyright and narration, Sean Myers. About the author. With One Bound, Tex Was Free is the first novel for some years by Ronnie Quest, the eminent authoress. It will be remembered that Miss Quest suffered a total breakdown some 15 years ago after completing her acclaimed piano trilogy, consisting of My Favourite Piano, The Piano Thieves, and My Brilliant Piano. Miss Quest has published many novels, including The Bride's Mistake, for which she received the Literature Medal from Zaire, and The Dead Barrister, for which she was made a Fellow of the Royal Bhutanese Institute of Kickboxing. After her discharge from the sanatorium in Switzerland, where she had been taken following her breakdown, Miss Quest embarked upon a course of study. Now completely and very publicly sane, with a certificate testifying to that effect, she took herself off to Dublin, where she studied obscurity at Trinity, emerging barely 18 months later with a master's degree, M. Obsc. Trin, and a hangover. It was at Trinity, of course, that she developed an interest in rugby, which she still plays. Miss Quest is the great-great-grandniece of Dr. Artemus Skittle, the founder of Booze and Milne. Dedication. To whom it may concern. Forward. In a cave. Thub considers what he has witnessed that afternoon, standing at the edge of a wood, resting, after unsuccessfully chasing a small deer, stands catching his breath. Hears a noise, not an animal noise, nor human. He looks about. Nothing. The day, already close, has warmed considerably and is becoming unbearably hot. The ice, snow, and permafrost that reached almost to the middle of the planet have retreated as the planet warmed, reflecting the almost imperceptible shift in the globe's trajectory. Where Thub now stands was uninhabitable tundra barely 150 years before. But he knows nothing of this, beyond the oral tradition of his group, that tells of a great cold that covered the world. By contrast, he is hot, tired, and empty-handed, having failed to catch dinner for the clan. Time to rest a moment and plan the next move. In the boundless jungles of the cortex. Tarzan gazed down thoughtfully at the young English boy paddling the dugout. Tarzan was most impressed with the lad's application, making swift progress through the muddy waters of the River Pin. Boy stroked his moustache thoughtfully. He had never seen Tarzan so taken by anything as this pale English boy and his ridiculously small brother. Perhaps he was just the tiniest bit jealous. The ways of men are strange. It was doubly frustrating since Cheetah had drunk the last of the port, and that left only coca leaves between boy and eternity. The clarion call of Baby Howard's gaunt voice rang out. "I say, bro, I found that cigarette card you lost. It's here in your pocket. It must have slipped through the lining." Toynbee's joy knew no bounds, for this was his treasured card of Sir Stanley Matthews. Thub lies down, and, looking up, sees the source of the noise heard before. Two branches of the old tree beside which he lay are rubbing together. He watches, resting. After a while he notices smoke coming from the point where the two branches touch. Thub knows that smoke usually signifies fire, but can see no flame. He watches. Then something happens, which is to change his life and the lives of all his descendants. A leaf falls and is caught by the rubbing branches, and he sees flame. Thub gets up and returns to the camp when rested. Puzzled by what he has seen, he knows it is important, but he doesn't know why. There is a piece of information that he has, but he doesn't know what it is. The problem of food is more pressing. The return to camp is slow and difficult. Thub's clan has found a hidden place, surrounded by bog and marsh, and, protected by inaccessibility, has remained in this place for several generations. The children have grown strong and tall, adults reaching at least 5 feet, sometimes more. Back in camp, the problem of food has been resolved. by the woman Glar, who had collected leaves, grasses and roots. Everybody eats. Across the bog, Thub can see a small fire in the wood where he rested that afternoon. The group watches the fire for some time. Finally, Glar says that it is a pity they have not some of that fire to warm themselves, because the night is becoming cold. And then he had it. Thub had that little piece of information that he needed. He goes to his cave above the camp to think free of distractions. He thinks of the 2 branches he watched during the afternoon and what eventually happened. He understands that he has seen how to make fire. Men all over the globe were arriving at the same conclusion. Thub may have been the first, or not. He was the first in his clan, and his group the first in the area for some time, to have fire whenever they wanted. Toynbee stands gobsmacked, having realized that he stands in the place where his family history was made. It took Thub some weeks of practice to get the business of rubbing the sticks together and timing the addition of kindling, but once he had it, there were no more cold nights, or cold winters, or cold food, no weak and sickly children. The whole clan took Thub's name and stayed in the place where Thub had found fire. When the leader of the clan dies, he is taken up to Thub's cave, where there is a very deep hole in which he is placed. The pit of Thub. Thub himself lived for a very long time, and may have been nearly 90 when he died. Thub was a legend, not merely because he had discovered fire, but because he understood the information, knew what to do with it. Thub's clan became powerful, not only because of the discovery of fire, but because Thub understood how to control the information, and used it to make his clan strong. They had no interest in controlling others. Too much effort, and it makes you a target. Thub had a number of children. Most of them died, either during birth or during the really cold winter that arrived without warning one year, as if the powerful planet that had been slowly warming and becoming more hospitable to the life that crawled all over her surface, suddenly flexed her muscles and turned on a fiercely cold winter, to remind life that she was still the mistress. Anyway, 2 of Thub's children survived. It was the 2 who had arrived together, a boy, Fossen, and a girl, Toch. They both grew to be tall and athletic, but as he grew older, Fossen became strange and taciturn, and would spend long periods away hunting, often returning covered in the blood of the animals he had slaughtered, wild-eyed and dragging his dray piled high with carcasses. Sometimes it would take as many as 3 or 4 men to maneuver the dray back into the camp. Although Fossen was the leader of the clan after Thub died, he interfered very little in the affairs of the clan beyond the settling of disputes. In this he was fairly astute. Not being particularly wise, he carefully watched the reactions of his people as the facts were presented. Thus, his decisions invariably reflected majority sentiment. This may not always have been just, but it made him popular. Toch had been given in marriage to the headman of a nearby clan at the age of 9. She produced several children and happily remained in that group until the day Fossen visited calumny upon their heads. The life that Fossen pursued had finally become bizarre. His hunting trips began to stretch into weeks, sometimes months. The habitual slaughter had taken its toll. He was often unable to relate to other humans, except with grunts and growls. He was wont to evacuate his bowels or micturate as the mood took him, irrespective of what he or others were engaged upon at the time. He also took to lying with any woman or girl in the clan, regardless of age or domestic situation. Thankfully, he had no interest in females who had not yet reached puberty, but had lain with every other female in the group, including his mother, and none could stop him. Indeed, one man had remonstrated with him and tried to stop him effectively violating his woman, so Fossen had torn the man's head from his body, without rancour, even animosity. Just something that needed to be done, like spending his seed, which was done without lust or desire pretty much. Nor was it always violation. He was, after all, the leader of the clan, athletic and pleasing to look on when he hadn't just returned from hunting, and far stronger than any man in the group. Toch, by contrast, had become a fully contributing member of her group. Although her man was more than 20 years older than her, he had been quite considerate of her. Naturally, she had to discharge the duties of a wife, but at this moment in history, not unusual for a 9-year-old. Her man made it easier and more bearable. She loved him almost from the start. Fortunately, Toch had inherited her father's wisdom, together with her twin's athleticism. She became a capable partner for her man, and joint leader of their clan. She often went on the hunt with the men. She was considered one of their best hunters. However, without ever approaching the extremes of Fossen. On one occasion, there had been a confrontation with another group. Toch had taken on the group's best fighter and beaten him. When they saw what a woman could do, the other group left quietly, leaving behind gifts of weapons and cloth. Toch's clan prospered, and so it should have continued, were it not for Fossen. It is well to note at this juncture that there was an enormous fight between the only surviving children of Thub, Fossen and his twin sister Toch, which split the clan. After being utterly vanquished by Toch, Fossen slinks off with the remnants of his followers and settles somewhere in the east of Europe. There are no direct reports of him or his group, although there are many rumours of a band of wild folk who live in the forests of Eastern Europe. There are tales of sorcery and cannibalism, and the stories are often confused with the history of Vlad the Inhaler, the brutal chain smoker. In fact, most folk tales of vampirism and wizardry in that part of the world can be traced back to Fossen's group, who may very well be living still in those parts. The most recent report concerns an episode during the Second World War. About 200 kilometres south of what was then Leningrad, on the southern shores of Lake Chudo, lies the town of Pskov. No resident of that town dreamt of entering the thick woods which bordered the town in those days, because it was well known, even as far as Moscow, that there was a band of wolfmen living there. The Fossonyi, as they were called by the locals, did unspeakable things to any foolish enough to enter the forest. A panzer division was on its way to join the German assault on Leningrad. The commander, Rolf Müller, decided to pass through the forest rather than go around it. He was a fine, if somewhat pedestrian soldier, and believed in being direct in all things. Although he had heard vague rumours concerning the woods in those parts, his dependable Munchen upbringing did not permit him to believe in such nonsense, even if the Führer did. The locals stayed silent on the subject of the Fossonyi. The Germans were invaders after all, so why warn them? A little gunfire was heard, and then nothing. Of course, when the division failed to turn up in Leningrad, a detail was dispatched to discover what had happened. It, too, disappeared. Fortunately for Pskov, German resources were so stretched by the disastrous attack on Leningrad that it was not feasible to bomb the forest. Besides, when Hitler consulted his spiritual advisers, they told him in the strongest terms to leave the area alone. All that had remained of an entire panzer division was the little bloodied head of Rolf Müller on a pole. The wolfmen had devoured everything, including the tanks. In fact, it was rumoured that after it was torn from his body, Rolf's head was kept alive so that he might witness the destruction of his division. The clan that remained behind with Toch went on to become the family Dube, who are now Dukes of Esperance. Although one of the most powerful families in Europe at one time, there only remains one male, Toynbee, to continue the line. It would appear that Toynbee's vulnerable mental condition does not augur well. The vast fortune that the family built up and controlled over the centuries has been converted to a trust, the Esperance Foundation, which is administered by a board of trustees. Jack Thatcher's bold expedition to the south face of the Beau Massif in 1922 and subsequent discovery of the Beau Codex was financed by the Esperance Foundation. The foundation, under the stewardship of Hilary, father of the present Duke of Esperance, was very active in the early part of the 20th century. The foundation is funded entirely from the Esperance family fortune. However, its aims are not entirely clear. Records show that the Esperance Foundation supplied funds to the Frères Montgolfier for their ballooning experiments, not to mention a long list of other scientific experiments, Yet the Foundation's sphere of interest seems to be more than just scientific. Records indicate donations to various charities and religious groups, universities, and an orphan's home. Cheek by jowl with these apparently philanthropic charitable gifts, there appears to be incontrovertible proof of some financial involvement in a number of small wars around the globe. Indeed, the family name of the Dukes of Esperance, Dube, recurs constantly in the turmoil that beset Europe during the Middle Ages. Although the Dube took no active part in the English Civil War, both Cromwell and the Royalists seem to have received material support from the family. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his diaries, refers constantly to a mysterious Il Patrone, whose subsequent research has shown to be Nigel, 12th Duke of Esperance. The Esperance family have always had extensive holdings throughout Europe, and it is likely that Niccolò Machiavelli stayed at their villa in Tuscany. The Bow Codex, discovered by the young English adventurer and explorer Jack Thatcher, was discovered in a cave on the south face of the Bow Massif at about 18,000 feet. There has been some dispute among scholars concerning the origin of the manuscript, but it is now widely accepted as being Greek in origin, and possibly the work of Amanuensis the Magnificent. Perhaps the major argument for accepting Greek authorship rather than Roman is the fact that it is written in Greek. However, that still leaves unanswered the questions surrounding the thermal toga and spiked climbing sandals that were found in the cave at the same time, which are clearly Roman. In fact, there is nothing to indicate that the Romans ever discovered the Bow Massif, or that the great Roman climber Caius Hilarius ever climbed beyond Cisalpine Gaul. It is indeed a puzzle. Hilarius, of course, was assassinated on the steps of the Odeon by a faction of the Senate who were bitterly opposed to his involvement in the environmental movement. It will be remembered that in the year before his death, Hilarius had, with other members of the Catacombs chapter, tried to repatriate several of the lions from the Colosseum. His suggestion that the lions be replaced with German shepherds was met with derision. It was generally believed that men in lederhosen and woolly jackets were hardly likely to instill fear into the Christians. Hilarius was greatly mourned. I miss him still. We're indebted to the romantic novelist Ronnie Quest for her translation of the Bow Codex. Celebrated for her romantic novels, her ancient Greek scholarship is less well known. The Bow Codex. High atop the Footscray Alps, on the highest peak of all, Mount Simpson, sits the home of the gods, and there, master of all he surveys, sits Bernie, the father of the gods. The home of the gods is very nice, with columns, stone lions and lovely Georgian feature windows. There is underfloor heating and wall-to-wall carpet, with a jacuzzi as well. All very tastefully decorated in pastel tones with lots of billowing gossamer curtains. Soft music plays constantly. Swedish CD player, state of the art. All's right with the world, and Bernie's in his heaven. Alas, no. Bernie is very pissed off, and the gods are in a turmoil. Ulysses and Bolixes, the wicked sons of Fornax and Byron, have stolen Hyspida, the furry magnet. For centuries, Hyspida, the darling of the gods, was in the care of Circe on the island of Aea, but the brothers aforementioned plotted and schemed to kidnap her and take her to their cave in the Parramatta Road, for they desired the loveliness of her for their very own to cheer their squalor. Finally, they saw their chance when Circe was called away on business, and, disguising themselves as child welfare officers, the miscreant brothers went to Aea and removed Hyspida. "What do you mean by it?" thundered Bernie. Circe looked nervous, and well she might, as she glanced around at the array of angry gods. Isocles, the god of bar fridges, his wife Cheryl, the goddess of hospitality, Acapanthus, the god of window dressers, Calendula, the goddess of odd socks. They were all gathered in the rumpus room on Mount Simpson. Bernie stood, if it could be called standing, and shook his finger at Circe. "You have been very, very, very naughty, and now we're completely stuffed because we can't do nothing." Circe looked puzzled. "But you're gods. You can do anything." "Hyspida is mortal." "Yes." "The malefactors Ulysses and Bolixes are mortal." "Yes."
"But we can't touch it then."
"Why not?"
"You know the rules, that's just the way it works. We've got to get a mortal to get her back."
"Ring the cops!"
"Shut up, Agapanthus. We need a hero, not one of your little chums in uniform. Someone of superhuman strength who is used to dealing at an executive level with the ability to take decisions. Cheryl, who are the top management guys around?
Oh, I'd have to say Chambers and Chambers. They've just had a major success.
Yeah, I heard about that. One of their guys just took out the swine of the world, didn't he?
Humongous. And Humongous has the added advantage of an MBAP.
MBAP.
Master of Business Admin and Punching. It was a terrific operation. He finally cornered the swine of the world in the Sahara forest, and after a battle which lasted 6 months, he brought the monster to its knees, where it remains to this day. Of course, they uprooted every tree in the forest in the process, and the place is going to be desolate for centuries.
Somewhere, Bennett's hollow truckle. Humongous it is then, he's our man. Cersei, get a fax off to him this afternoon. Make sure he's got everything that he needs. You know, full wineskin, magic seeds, golden arrow, and a kipper.
The quest of Humongous for the furry magnet has since become one of the most successful legends that Bernie has undertaken. Having received his brief from Bernie, Humongous set off in search of the unfortunate Hispida. By this time, the Wicked Brothers had set Hispida to work making curtains for their cave. Oh, Hispida hated sewing, not to mention ironing. In a very short time, Humongous had arrived at the far distant island which the brothers call home, travelling on the back of a giant Malaysian bird with a bunch of pissed footballers. On arrival, Humongous went immediately in search of Hispida. Firstly, Humongous found a strange community of women who devoted their time to pursuit of the arts in the southeast of the island. In response to his inquiries about Hispida, the women advised our hero to head north, where there was a community of men rumoured to be living beside the sea. Humongous journeyed for many days and some nights as well, until he came to the community of men that he'd been told about. When he arrived, there was a large celebration or festival in progress, and it seemed that some of the women from the women's community that he had visited were already there. There was a very gay atmosphere, and much making of music. Also many men wearing strange costumes. Humongous asked everyone he met if they had seen the girl Hispida or the two brothers, but it seemed that none knew them. Finally, he fell in with a bunch of sly men who seemed to know more than they would say, perhaps because they were Danish and spoke little English. And this is where the wineskin came in handy. He got totally rat-assed with this band of men who turned out to be architects. By and by, the leader of the architects, who was called Joe by his companions, became more and more interested in the small bag that contained the magic seeds. Somebody had gone out for pizza, which was not at all magic, and as they sat around a fire on the shores of the harbour eating their pizzas, Joe became enraged because he had wanted extra anchovy on his and had got none at all. By this time the wineskin was almost empty. Two of the architects were fighting each other, and a third was revealing to the company what he had just eaten. It was now that Joe stood, and grabbing the bag containing the magic seeds, flung them up in the air, scattering them all around. Before too long, everyone, including Humongous, was in a deep sleep. This may have been a consequence of the scattering of the seeds, or it may have had something to do with the consumption of the contents of the wineskin. In any event, when they awoke in the morning, where the magic seeds had fallen, there now appeared a group of gigantic singing rocks. Now we get to the interesting bit. The two brothers, Ulysses and Bolixes, had never heard opera before, for this is what the rocks were singing, and were so transported by the sounds that they were distracted long enough to allow Humongous to approach their cave in the Parramatta Road, and, with the golden arrow, pierce the heart of the dog, Bonox, which the brothers had set to guarding Hispida, and finally how Humongous, disguised as a kipper, had rescued Hispida and restored her to Circe on the island of Aea, where she remains to this day, the furry magnet, adored of the gods and worshipped of all men. The gods, in their gratitude, gave Humongous a taxi license without doing the knowledge, and the miscreant brothers remain in their cave to this day, jealously guarding a kipper, having failed to realize that it is not Hispida. While it is usual for the current Duke to be completely involved with the activities of the Trust, in Toynbee's case this is not so. After his first psychotic episode, Toynbee found it more convenient just to drop off the radar. He walks along with halting step. His name is Toynbee Doob. His teeth are slightly luminous. He cleans them both with Zoob. And so, at Famished Gate, Doob the Invincible swings through the foliage of history on a genetic vine. Toynbee had never seen the old Duke before, but the imposing gentleman in the library chair seemed to know all there was to know about our youthful hero. Baby Howard slept peacefully. Although older than his sibling, he often dozed and seemed to need the rest. The old Duke regarded Toynbee thoughtfully. The image of himself at that age. Indeed, it was himself at that age. Doob spawned themselves, not create anew. The old Duke was looking at himself. If the old Duke had a descendant, that descendant would be Baby Howard. But he knew nothing of the 17-year-old scrap asleep in Toynbee's pocket. Had he known, he would have eaten him, swallowed him whole, and washed him down with a goblet of Bega Sicilia. After a moment, the old Duke spoke in soft, clear tones. "My dear, you are to know things, to understand things which are germane to the business of being a Doob. I do not wish you to talk. No response is required. I wish you to listen. Absorb what you can. Reflect upon it. Doob are Ramapithecus, the lost 10th tribe, if you will. However, we are not Jews, and we share nothing with Jewry except our Ramapithecus beginning. Cro-Magnon arrived and set about wiping out Ramapithecus, and this they did by killing and interbreeding. Some of us removed ourselves to a little inhospitable corner beyond Europe, and here we remain. Tolf, Cro-Magnon has despised short, dark Ramapithecus ever since, but he did not find our islands for several thousand years, because the thaw had cut us off from the mainland, where once a man could walk from Sweden to Norfolk. There is now a great sea. Some Ramapithecus had organized into groups and called themselves Angles or Picts or whatever, but Doob stay apart and do not make themselves a target. The nature of power is such that when a group becomes powerful, feels powerful, then they want to quantify that power, test it, and the only way is find another group and subjugate, obliterate that group. Doob survive. That is our strength. We remain. There are not many of us. There have never been many of us. We are constant. The old Duke lapsed into silence for a while. Toynbee was happy as he had ever been, for the only father he had known until now was Arthur Dubbo, the strange jobbing gardener, eldritch one might say. The boy reflects, considering his father, the old Duke, a man of average height, fairly well built, with snow-white hair kept very neat. Of course, Toynbee knew that he must have a father, but he had never seen him or heard mention of him until today. Baby Howard remains in Toynbee's pocket, playing with his button collection. The stripling considered how well the octogenarian Duke seemed, doubtless due to his daily swim in the stream, which flowed across the estate and into the Thames. Toynbee made a mental note to look up Ramapithecus before his next meeting with the old Duke. But now the lad's thoughts turned to other matters. Of late, Toynbee had been troubled by the suspicion that his life was not his own. He was becoming more convinced, with the passage of time, that he was someone else. His own experiences felt alien. His life felt somehow odd to him,
and he had fleeting glimpses of this other life that he knew was really his. Sometimes at night he would hear the call of a coyote or the soft whinny of a lovely palomino. It was all incomprehensible to the young shaver, and the longing for a woman called Ruby, whom he had never met, was especially disturbing. Besides, he knew he was a legendary hero. He must be. He felt heroic. Maybe he'd been stolen by gypsies. "Why so thoughtful?" piped a little voice from his pocket, breaking Toynbee's reverie. Toynbee wondered what all this had to do with him. He had lived in this old house throughout his life, and he had never seen the old man before. In fact, he'd only seen his mother once, on the occasion of his older brother's birth. Beelzebub Confections. Proprietor J.X.A. Beelzebub since 1899. The paper bag, now empty of Beelzes, caught on a stalk of grass and was quickly snatched up by one of the herd of grazing bus conductors. Joe glanced at the thief on the wall, and noting that it was not quite 7 a.m., poured himself a jar of porter. Another day begins for Joseph Xavier Aloysius Beelzebub with a customary facilitating beaker, ballast for the bladder of legend, a bladder of 100 years standing, as 'twere. It will be remembered that the birth of JXA had been a nightmare, not only a breech birth, but also possessed of an erection which had necessitated the use of forceps and much skill on the part of the obstetrician. Joe reflected briefly upon the carefree days of 1899, when he had founded the business, a jolly 19-year-old embarking on an adventure. His reverie was interrupted by the fax clearing its throat, a communication from his man in Queensland, Arthur Dubbo, to inform him of the dispatch of several tons of sugar from the Beelzebub sugar plantation just outside Cairns. Under the inspired captaincy of Barry Hakamoto, the sugar-laden trireme would make its way shortly to Dublin, for it was one of the swiftest wooden container vessels of its class. There was an ugly moment during the last voyage when Barry had attempted the keel-hauling of a young stowaway. The stowaway in question had turned out to be related to a peer of the realm, and Joe had spent a large sum of money, an extraordinary sum of money, to avert retribution. Barry was all but indispensable to the operation of Beelzebub Confections. A tap at the door announced the arrival of Tex Corrigan, for it was he. Of course, dearest reader, the door did not actually say anything, but the oily old confectioner knew that it would be his works manager, as it had been these last 90-odd years. "Gertrude Pugh starts this morning, governor."
"What? The printmaker?"
Yes, Gov.
Jesus, Joseph and Mary, are you telling me that you've hired blind Pugh?"
She don't much care for that name, governor."
"Have you seen the woman's prints?"
"Yes, sir, I have that."
"I rest my case, Tex."
There is no other printmaker presently available, sir."
"That is a sorry thing indeed,"
and shakes his head.
"when a halfway decent printmaker cannot be found to work in a confectionery factory."
"Yes, sir." Tex now looking sheepish. "A sorry thing indeed."
Blind Pugh it is."
The finality of the confectioner's last statement dismissed his works manager. So, tipping his 10-gallon hat to the back of his head, the sugar cowboy turned to the door. Copy of fax sent from Viscount Plunge of Lucre, CEO of Zoob Corp, Transvaal, to Ivor Scrottage, London agent of Zoob Corp.
"Ivor, you old pisswit. I found your communication re Beelzebub Confections most interesting, as it sounds like the sort of company we'd be interested in. It seems they're cashed up to buggery. That tight old Irishman has obviously been sucking it away for years. I've also discovered a substantial portfolio of properties throughout southern Ireland, which the canny old bugger doesn't run through Beelzebub Confections. Usual form, soak up some loose stock through Smegnom and see if anything is moving in the undergrowth. For God's sake, keep out of the way of the Australians, especially that perineum Barry Boxer. Beelzebub will probably get wind of it, but it doesn't matter because he thinks he's secure. Send word with Marlene when you've got it organised, and don't let this one go rhomboid. Plunge. P.S. How are the boils? Did the cream work?
As he pedalled through the dawn, Joe remembers the fax sent him by his broker, informing him of the impending takeover bid by Zoob Corp, the rapacious South African conglomerate. He says to himself, Bacchanalia, is it? Bacchanalia, from the old French, an orgy of piracy. Well, I must look away to see it clearly. Beelzy's put the bounce in Baby Howard, the Beelzy boy. And now, as he cycles through the ragged fringes of Dublin, Joe sees thin houses standing about in groups, chatting idly to pass the time until the dole office opens. Here Cormac, a tidy semi-detached, conversing with a cottage called Neville. There, a dog lifting its leg on a corner of Finn. It is a cold morning. All waiting for social security, that tendril of the vine of government. Davenport Willard gazed fish-eyed at the scene in social security. As always, people shuffling uneasily, preparing themselves to do battle with the ogre of state. The office of Davenport is plain, partition board to about waist high, then mirrored glass to the ceiling. Davenport may look upon his unsuspecting sheep, unobserved. Ruby Lunch is led through the waiting unemployed by Hooligan, clutching her baby doll in her arms. Ruby is uncaring of all but her baby doll, Paris, as she walks into the giantess. The language of herself, the mighty Shay, need not be repeated here, since it is related elsewhere in stories of that sort. The solicitous social worker choreographs Ruby away as a security guard materializes to indicate the threat of ejection to mighty Shay. She hitches her skirts in an equally threatening manner, and the guard melts back into the shadows. After all, it's only a job. The unwatched Davenport turns away from this ripple to continue the attempt to insert his head into his rectum, there to discover the lost portion of his life. Back at Famished Gate, however. Life continues at the house where I started life. However, after my trouble, the trustees sold it as part of a rationalization of the activities of the foundation. I think there is a nice symmetry to the situation. The house where I grew up now functions as a boarding house for the dispossessed, and I am living there again. Nobody here knows of my former involvement with the house, and they just know me as Tex. And the trustees don't know where I am. I live in a vacuum, just marking time. Anyway, I'm more Tex now than Toynbee. Most of the land around the house has been sold and redeveloped. It has erupted in lots of nasty little red brick houses like boils. Sad how things change. I've changed. I live in what used to be the dining room. Of course, the mirror has gone from over the fireplace, and the fireplace is different too. On the approach to Fetter Grange. With one bound, Tex was free. Glancing over his shoulder, he was in time to see the ice bridge tumble into the yawning chasm below. The chasm would soon be fast asleep. Phew, thought Tex. That was a close shave. Another second and I should have been sitting with my ancestors. Decent chaps all, but I don't want to join them just yet. He stroked his lantern drawer thoughtfully and made a mental note to buy a new wig, as he remembered the words of the oracle. Unfortunately, it was a typographical error that had sent Tex to the oracle of Delhi for guidance in his pursuit of the rogue peer, Philip, Viscount Plunge of Lucca, better known as Filthy Lucca. Tex's mentor, Shylock Holmes, the merchant of Baker Street, was still unable to understand what Tex was doing in India. But no matter, the intrepid Tex knew no fear. The nickname Kevlar Nuts had been earned
during many years of chasing miscreants around the globe. The boy hero pressed on, trudging through the snow along the ridge for the remainder of the day. It was a slow progress, since Tex's highly polished riding boots were not well suited to the alpine conditions, although his Harris tweed Norfolk jacket had kept him tolerably warm. Tex was starting to feel a little bit hungry now, and he felt in his pocket for the last bar of plain chocolate. His first night on the mountain, Tex had been raided by a Swiss Yeti. Everything was gone except most of what he was wearing. Mind you, Tex was lucky that it had been a Swiss, and not a bloodthirsty Himalayan. Swiss Yetis being only interested in goods for barter. So Tex found himself once again in a bit of a tight spot. The light was fading. Even blind Freddy could see there was a fairly major storm brewing, and the path had become quite narrow. In fact, the ledge was down to about 6 inches wide at this point, and getting narrower. Circling high overhead was an osprey, the feared bird of prey found in these parts. A glint from the bird's bright plumage caught Tex's eye before he heard its raucous cry, part shriek, part cackle, part whine, part inviting whisper. The beady black eyes of the osprey, rather over-made up, fastened briefly on Tex. No, he wouldn't do. He was too thin, and he didn't seem to have a motor car. Mind you, the osprey was hungry. It should be remembered that the osprey consumes its own body weight in precious stones every 24 hours. Maybe the little thing on the ledge would stave off hunger until she could find a proper feed. Surely things couldn't get any worse for our hero. Suddenly, Tex slipped, but managed to grasp the edge. He gazed thoughtfully down into the black silhouette of his mind, where he could just make out the forbidding abyss of Fetter Grange. By a superhuman effort, he managed to pull himself back up to the path. Hang it, he thought. I'll bivouac here for the night. Meanwhile, in the registered offices of Zoob Corp, Lord Plunge turns to face his minions. I hear a rumour that His Grace, the Duke of Esperance, is unwell. Very unwell, and is unable to discharge his obligations vis-à-vis the Esperance Foundation. I believe we should put the Irish project in abeyance for the moment, and should direct our efforts to discovering a means to acquire or control the vast reservoir of cash which is currently in the purse of that organization, and keep me posted on the daily condition of that wretched Doob. Were you not at Outlands together, sir?
Indeed, and I didn't care for him then either.
Welcome to Fetter Grange. Fetter Grange is a unique hospital in the mental health system. The house itself is a fine example of Georgian architecture set in 30 acres of rolling parkland. The landscaping was undertaken just after completion of the house by the Swiss landscaper Herman Magwitch. Magwitch is remembered largely for his contribution to the Australian landscape, notably the Nullarbor Plain. Here at Fetter Grange, our highly trained and qualified staff will provide the very best care for your loved one or relation. The emphasis at Fetter Grange is on full cure and rehabilitation, rather than merely management of disorders. Our director, Doc Skittle, has been one of the pioneers of research into the use of vitamin and mineral supplements in the treatment and management of mental disorders. Dr. Derek Phoenix, our research consultant, is well known as an astrologer and clairvoyant. Our head nurse, Miss Dimphna Padbury, was director of psychiatry at Butlins for many years. And the final key member of our management team is the mighty Shay, door control. Fetter Grange operates to the highest standards, and we find that many of our patients come back again and again. Extract from the Fetter Grange brochure. I append a report by Sean Hooligan on the current Duke of Esperance's circumstances. Mr. Hooligan is employed as a nurse at Fetter Grange Psychiatric Hospital. Report on the patient, Toynbee Doob, Duke of Esperance. Your man Doob was admitted to Fetter Grange in January of 1987 and has remained here as a patient since that time. I have known His Grace since coming to work at Fetter Grange about 2 years ago. I would say that my knowledge of the patient would be better than most, since I have been his contact nurse for most of that time, including Doc Skittle, who I have noticed seems very stressed during our recent conversations. I think Doc Skittle should probably have a little holiday. Toynbee was brought to Fetter Grange after having been found lying in the middle of the Strand, naked and attempting to lick his gonads. His only response to the officers apprehending him was to growl ferociously and try to bite one of them. He then availed himself of the leg of a lady passer-by, apparently with the object of procreation. I understand that during his first 6 months with us, he did not respond to staff except to bark at him. Until I came to Fetter Grange, Toynbee made little or no improvement, and it was felt by his supervising doctor that irreversible damage had been done to his neuron paths by his psychosis, and that, as a consequence, he was likely to require full-time care for the rest of his life. He was receiving a high dose of Megadrax, one of the results of which was to cause him to appear sedated, although, of course, his medication was not a sedative, but designed to replace and stimulate the body's natural ability to produce dopamine, which had been suppressed by an imbalance in the endocrine system, possibly as a result of stress or drug abuse. Doc Phoenix explained it all to me one day over a pint. I reckon between us, Derek and I could run this place while Doc Skittle had a little break. But when I suggested it, Derek went really strange. Oh well. In the time that I have been at Fetter Grange, I have seen Toynbee's medication reduced to about half of its former level. However, Toynbee is still fairly slow and only seems dimly aware of life outside the hospital. He has received very few visitors, apart from his brother, Howard, who is very much younger, about 15 years, I should say, and his sister, Tiffany, who is younger than Toynbee, but older than the brother. Curiously, they never seem to visit at the same time. For the last year or so, Toynbee has been writing. It's difficult to make head or tail of what he has written. It's very fragmented. Of course, he's still having hallucinations and delusions, and he insists that the writing is not his, but has been dictated to him by a woman called Ronnie Quest. I'm not sure what to make of it, but he's obviously happier. Extracts from Toynbee's diary. Monday. The shell game. Every man, woman and child is a player. From the moment you're born, you're playing. You don't know the rules, you don't know who you are playing, and you start off with no skills. And the first thing that happens when you get to the table is the dealer takes your essence, your kernel from you, and places it under a shell. Then he moves the shells around, and you spend the rest of your life trying to guess which shell it's under. Of course, you acquire skills as you go along, and the player has a mind which can become a wonderfully creative and inventive tool. It can even outmaneuver the house. But the house is covered because they have built a flaw into the brain of the player. Freedom of choice. By giving us the ability to make our own decisions, the houses ensure that we are at liberty to make the wrong ones. And on top of all that, your poor lonely little kernel isn't even under any of the shells. It has been palmed by the dealer and then filed away under Q for quiddity. Tuesday. The world is composed of candles and moths. Candles throw out all the light, and the moths flutter around trying to get close to the source of the light. The doob are candles. We make no showy flame, but we are candles nevertheless. My father told me of the mighty gene, the ruler of all life. The gene controls every action, every thought, and every desire. The gene must rule supreme, must dominate all. Its one purpose, to grow stronger and survive. See, when I see a woman whom I find attractive, that is my genes, the essence of me, my quiddity, saying they can make stronger genes with her genes. My genes have trained me to recognize the features that facilitate life, such as large breast or an ample bottom. On the other hand, aggression is caused by my genes saying, we don't like those genes. They are a threat to our survival. Every action in this world is initiated by the mighty gene, and it is foolish to fight it. The doob have merely bypassed it. We know of it, but do not struggle against it. I have seen and learned, and may yet suppress carnal desire at last. I shall never master the mighty gene, but shall never be enthralled to it. I am Doob. I have gazed upon the burnished face of insanity, and found joy in my misery. Wednesday. A tragic soul, the pea, so tiny and sad and green. Not quite so nice as a truffle, but nicer by far than a bean. Thursday. Sherlock Holmes, the merchant of Baker Street, turned to his young companion. "Tex," he said, "you must find this plunge, this wretched malefactor, this filthy lucre. He must be brought to book for his misdeeds. You shall go directly to Luxembourg, to where he was last seen in the company of Wild Bill Skittle." "What, the evil wizard of international finance?" "The same, and don't interrupt. Now, you will go and see if you can't pick up the trail of this malefactor, and when I have completed my inquiries, I shall send you further instructions." Of course, dear reader, it was these instructions from Holmes which contained the fateful typographical error that sent our young hero on a wild goose chase to the Indian subcontinent, seeking the Oracle of Delhi. Eheu! Which is where, dear reader, our hero ran foul of Gaston, the Toad of France, who with the evil Clossops was on an errand for the aforementioned plunge of lucre. Friday. It's not so bad, really. I really hate, having to run after all those bleeding sticks for Hooligan. It goes really strange if I don't do it. Well, at least they've cut down on my medication. But I still can't think straight. Not their straight, my straight. It's kind of like being stoned, only it's no fun and there's no control. I hate it. My coordination's fucked as well. End of extract. Between his writing and our little walks, he seems to be on the mend, and his retrieving skills have improved out of sight. There has been a little trouble recently. Toynbee was very unhappy when a skull was removed from his room. Like all the patients, he's permitted some personal effects, providing there is no danger from them. Well, Toynbee had this skull on the table beside his bed. He always claimed that it was an ancestor of his. He said it was thousands of years old. But that's just one of his wee stories. Anyway, this friend of Doc Skittle is paying a visit one day, and Doc Skittle is showing him round, so he shows him Toynbee's room. Well, the friend spots Toynbee's ancestor, the skull, sitting on the table and picks it up for a closer look. "Nice copy," he says. The doc looks at it and says, "I don't think so, it's a real skull." "Can't be," says the friend, "it's too old. We'll have to be Pleistocene or something. If it was real, it'd be in a museum." Anyway, the friend finally realizes that it is a real skull, and he convinces the doc that Toynbee must have stolen it. Even if he didn't, it ought to be somewhere where it can be researched. So they take it away and send it off to the Science Museum or somewhere like that. That's when everybody goes doolally, because it turns out to be much older than anything previously found, the oldest relic of modern man. Meanwhile, Toynbee is getting very upset and crying that he's been robbed, while the doc's friend is accusing Toynbee of thieving, or at the very least impeding scientific research. Now things start to get interesting. Firstly, for some reason, Toynbee's medication is increased. Well, he was getting very agitated. His brother, Howard, hasn't been in for a while, and he pays a visit. Of course, he's very pissed off to see your man looking so banjaxed, but he understands that Toynbee's medication is adjusted according to his general state. Well, this is where the artillery came in. Suddenly, legal paper was flying about like confetti at a wedding in Kinsale. The Esperance Foundation bound up anything to do with Fetter Grange tighter than the arsehole on a corkman at an orange parade. Doc Skittle moved very fast to defuse the situation and get the skull back. Once Toynbee's ancestor is ensconced again upon the bedside table, Fetter Grange gets the new wing we've been after, Doc Skittle's mate winds up as a research assistant in Bogota or somewhere, and I get a bonus. Toynbee has formed a strong attachment for a recently admitted patient, Ruby Lunch, who is Australian. It is not clear at this stage whether her psychosis is an episode or ongoing, since she isn't responding to very much at the moment, least of all the attentions of Toynbee. Ruby. Charlie says, I'm going to Melbourne. Got to take care of some business. Shadowing his undernourished excuse, Charlie Lunch shuffles from the kitchen. A life ravaged by wrong choices, draped across his shoulders. Ruby, his 3-year-old daughter, sits on the floor, engrossed in something, with bits of wood, wool, cotton, paper, fabric, glue and string, wire, a frying pan, anything she can find, almost tripping Charlie in his haste to catch his excuse, frightened of being abandoned to domestic carnage. He said it flatly, but Charity knows better. She knows that he's just going away. Charity hears the front door slam on her life and looks at her daughter as the air leaves her body, seamlessly switching between desolate, deserted wife and concerned mother. She says to her child, "What have you got there, Skerrick?" Ruby doesn't have all the words to describe it, so she just says, "A dolly. Daddy." For some time after he left, Ruby wandered the house looking for her father. Sometimes she looked in the garden as well. She knew he was there. He must be there. What had she done? Why was he hiding from her? Every time Charity thought she had contained her grief, she would glance out the window and see Ruby wandering about the garden aimlessly, trying to walk off her sadness. But Charlie was gone. In fact, Charlie had gone to Adelaide, where he had another family, and that was the last time Ruby saw her father for 10 years. She missed him very badly. She hated his guts, but she missed him. Ruby never forgave her father for deserting her, as he never forgave her for reminding him. Just before he left, something happened to Charlie. Maybe it affected things, maybe not, but it affected Ruby. Charlie Lunch was the first one to see the aliens. Funny, really, calling them aliens. He wasn't scared of them. They didn't feel alien at all. Still, Charlie saw them first. He was down in the paddock with Bob. Suddenly, all the hackles went up on Bob's back, but he didn't bark or growl or anything. There were 6 of them. They pulled up in a line, got off their bikes, and gathered in a group at the roadside. They didn't seem particularly interested in Charlie, but he kept a watchful eye on them. Without knowing why he knew, Charlie knew they were from outer space. It seemed logical that they would be here to see him first. Well, not logical perhaps, but it never occurred to him to question it, just as it never occurred to him to mention seeing them to anyone else. Charlie knew they were aliens, and Bob knew they were aliens too, but said nothing, as usual. After their 3rd spliff, the aliens got back on their bikes and carried on up the road. Charlie lay on his back in the middle of the paddock, gazing up at the sky, completely torched for the only time in his life. Of course, he didn't know he was stoned. For some time he just lay, listening to the voices of everyone he'd ever known, talking to him, whispering to him, shouting at him, wheedling him, keening, occasional bits of music, some screeching, excerpts from old news broadcasts on the television, a mob of parrots attacking an owl, canvas flapping in the wind, an ocarina, a thick skein of other sounds. The aliens had allowed Charlie to partake of the great knowledge they had at their fingertips. They had shared cigarettes and drinks with him, and he wondered if their alien smokes and drinks had in some way changed him, changed his genetic structure or something, which didn't really matter. Funny, though, even after spending all those hours with the aliens, he could not remember the conversation. Nothing they had said. Maybe they hadn't said anything. Yeah, that'd be right. They just looked inside his mind, and he had looked back at the universe. He had no curiosity about it all. Anyway, it had been dark for some hours when Charlie was overcome by an enormous hunger. So he stood up and wandered home.
Chas was very worried. Charlie tap danced and merely said he'd fallen asleep in the paddock without reference to the aliens. Bob said nothing, as usual. Chas was almost beside herself because whenever Charlie disappeared, it was usually for a couple of years or more. They had been keeping company for about 10 years before Ruby was born, but Charlie had actually only been around for half that time. Chas never questions Charlie. Charlie doesn't like questions, and she isn't sure that she wants to know. In some ways, these events are directly responsible for Ruby's psychosis in later years. Firstly, there is the possibility of heredity. Although Charlie's psychosis is manageable, it's always there. And then there was the stress, occasioned by Charlie's desertion when Ruby was 3, exacerbated by his eventual return. It was inevitable that Ruby would be caught in the sieve of the mental health system. The first time I saw Ruby, I was in love. Just like that. Ruby was unconscious, and there was a fetching white crescent of dried saliva calibrating the path of her psychosis from her mouth to her chin. At last she has found me, and I shall be saved. Oh, how we laughed, how we chuckled and chortled. We almost wept with laughter. Yes, he didn't know. He never suspected, not even for a second. Very naughty, really, but it's this new technique, and we wanted to try it out. We never meant any harm, honest. It was just so bloody funny, watching the little haemophiliac get up in the morning, never knowing if he was going to be Toynbee or Tex. Because the technique is not quite perfect yet, there's a little bit of spill. An occasional component from the other half filters through. It was Bennett, of course. Bennett, that giant of R&D, who had discovered the anomaly in the system. It will be remembered that Bennett wrote a complete adaptation of the orchestration of the chorale for percussion when he was 14. An extraordinary if pointless labour, and now he writes all his programs by ear. Of course, with the new technology, the systems make no audible noise, but Bennett still hears his programs. And it was Bennett, remember, who reprogrammed pedestrian lights so that they wink little messages in semaphore. The dervish of the bites he's been called by some. For my part, I call him Bennett. At any rate, we discovered Bennett's trick after the last party. Looking through the photographs of the party, we discovered that he was in every one. Unremarkable, except that Bennett was demonstrably elsewhere. In fact, he hadn't been near the place for the best part of a century. It was his RCO. Naturally, we wanted to know how he'd done it. He couldn't have tampered with the photographs directly, so we assumed that it was some kind of projection. Now, here is the interesting bit. Bennett had no personal recollection of the party. In fact, he was in Estepona on a working holiday as au pair to a Japanese family. Yet the people he was standing next to in the photos recalled seeing him and talking to him. It could mean only one thing. Bennett had successfully worked out how to clone himself. Or perhaps he was just very pissed. The ramifications of this far outstrip the advances made in the cloning of commercial TV presenters and politicians. And so, dear reader, Ruby and Toynbee are flung together by an importunate fate in the romantic setting of Fetter Grange. Ruby is Toynbee's force majeure. He will never lose his passion for his darling Ruby, notwithstanding his occasional lapses into sanity and consequent returns to society in the guise of Tex, the lonesome cowboy. Fortuitously, Toynbee's lapses into sanity often coincide with those of Ruby, the sad paradox of their lives being that, although united in their madness, they were separated when mad. Grendel's story. I changed my name to Bennett after getting into a massive punch-up with some Swedish hooligans, more precisely Gits. You've no doubt heard of the great Geet hero
Beowulf, who came to the aid of the Danes. Of course, you've only heard their side of the story. There's no mention of the fact that I was quietly living with my mother in our pond when these Danish chavs built a bloody great party room only a few metres away and was in there every night getting pissed and making a dreadful racket. Well, we tried for an asbo, but as officially registered ogres, we had no chance. And besides, they came up with some bullshit story that I am descended from Cain, whoever he is, when in fact my ancestor is Fossen. I was trying to study for my Open University degree in metaphysical electronics, and it was impossible with all the racket. So one night I went to complain, and you know how it is. Some geezer pushed me, I pushed back, and before you know it, I killed about 30 of them. I swear I only went over there to see if we could work something out. You see, I was working in the IKEA warehouse on flat-pack longboats during the day, and we was really busy with the pillaging season about to start, and the only time I had for study was in the evenings. Anyway, these chavs refused to be reasonable, so it turned into a nightly confrontation. Now, I still don't know how these geets got involved. They lived miles away, it was nothing to do with them, but they turned up mob-handed and started giving us all sorts of grief. Finally, it come down to a stand-up fight between me and this Beowulf geezer, who was their leader, and he ripped my bloody arm off. He was incredibly strong, the little blonde bastard. Well, now, he thought he'd killed me, but my mum looked after me because she'd once been a district nurse back in the days when it didn't matter if you was an ogre. Of course, I weren't able to fight no more, so I kept a low profile and got on with my studies. Anyway, there you have it. Then after this Asbo wolf killed my mother, I got myself a job in R&D and just concentrated on the metaphysics. When I heard that Beowulf was, in fact, one of the Doob, I decided to lay a trap for them. With my knowledge of metaphysical electronics, I have been able to create a little tear in the space-time continuum, which will contribute greatly to the discomfort and reversal of fortunes of that branch of the family. To that end, I've enlisted the help of Il Badger. Florenz Block trudges along Arder Street to the little park at the end that had formerly been a small part of the grounds of Famished Gate. The house itself stands not far from the park, the remains of what had been a reasonably handsome 18th century townhouse has been added to, dissected and devalued, so that it is now a disgraceful concatenation of styles, none of which sits well with another, the whole furiously protected by the trust responsible for keeping the barbarians at bay. None of this is of any moment in the life of Florenz Block, trudging towards the park where he will spend his day, champion of a miserable collection of ragged flowers, protecting them against pests of all classes, a duty discharged with a rancour born of disinterest. Once inside the park, Florenz goes to the little shed in the corner beside the compost heap to extract the tools of his craft. Not that he has the slightest intention of using them for their intended purpose, merely props to deliver the impression of industry. Off to one side is a small hill or mound, beside an ornamental pond. On the mound a clump of bamboo, with bushes around the base, and a couple of trees at one end of the pond. Florenz has placed a seat near the trees, from where he may observe the entrance to the park without being seen. Thus he spends his days, listening to his Walkman and reading newspapers that people have left behind in the park, and if, by mischance, his manager should arrive to check on him or give instructions, he is able to appear busy before he is spotted by authority. Convenient. And so it should have continued. Enter Fate, dressed in black PVC and crotch-high boots. One morning, while listening to his English lesson on his Walkman, he is surprised to observe a scarlet frog hop casually past him and into the pond. The colour of the frog is quite remarkable, and captures Florenz's attention. The frog swims to the further edge of the pond and gets out. It seems to Florenz that this remarkable creature then stopped and looked back at him over its shoulder. He is not sure, but he doesn't think that these creatures are normally able to do that.
Nevertheless, he is intrigued and goes around the pond to where the frog appears to be waiting. As he arrives, the frog hops nimbly back into the pond and disappears beneath the surface. Florenz waits for some time, but the creature does not reappear. Finally, looking down, he notices that where the frog has been sitting is not merely damp. The earth appears noticeably different from the surrounding area. Crouching down, Florenz brushes away the discoloured earth and reveals a small tunnel, like a burrow maybe. With the assurance of the ignorant, he inserts his arm in the tunnel as far as it will go, and encounters something hard and metallic. It does not even occur to Florenz that it might be an animal trap or something, so he feels around until he finds a handle and starts to drag it out. There is a problem. The box, or whatever it is, seems to be larger than the tunnel. Florenz grabs the trowel which he keeps to hand against the arrival of authority and uses it to widen the tunnel. Finally, he has extracted the box. It is closed, but not locked. Opening it, he discovers a bundle of papers, wrapped in oilskin which has protected them fairly well. There is some damp discoloration and some mould, but the papers are quite legible. However, not to Florenz. His grasp of English is still sketchy, and these papers seem to date back a couple of centuries. Later in the day, Florenz returns to the unremarkable rooming house where he lives, alongside a ragged collection of imperfect human beings huddled together for warmth and safety. An Edwardian receptacle, unpleasant though it may appear, it is infinitely preferable to the Albanian hillsides where Florenz has spent the last few years, in constant jeopardy of attack by brigands or terrorists, not to mention the hidden danger presented by massive amounts of pollution swirling about in that part of the world. The arrival of Florenz in the affluent society of London and subsequent disappearance into the crowd has been a life-changing result for him, and his friendship with the pretentiously failed academic, Eddie Valentine, has been a treat. It is the connection with Eddie which gives Florenz the key to the documents which he had unearthed that afternoon. Eddie has some knowledge of ancient documents and access to a comprehensive library. So, Florenz entrusts the documents to Eddie for deciphering. Florenz had also found a 50-quid note in the street outside the park on his way home, so he and Eddie slope off to the Frog in Arder Street, with the intention of overconsumption, the better, as Eddie puts it, to enhance their collective mobile reality. An opportunity presents itself. The following day, Eddie is most excited. The papers that Florenz has discovered appear to pertain to the family Dube, Dukes of Esperance, in their time one of the foremost families in Europe and one of the richest, the equal of the Medicis, the Borgias, the Bourbons, or any other grand dynasty, but totally lacking the dangerous desire to rule. Most of the papers are concerned with mundane household management. However, there is one document which names a certain Florian Black as direct heir to Ignace, 13th Duke of Esperance, although not his issue, and consequently heir to the massive Esperance fortune. Of course, both Eddie and Florenz remarked the loose similarity of the names, Florenz Block and Florian Black. It was discussed whether to take the documents to a museum or try and sell them back to the family, and would have ended there, but for a bizarre occurrence involving Florenz. His foreman turned up the following day and told him to report to Famished Gate in order to collect some garden tools. At the house, Florenz goes to the building where the tools are stored, which was once a rather handsome folly. It is of course locked, barred and chained, the better to protect the valueless implements contained therein. Using the keys that he has been given, Florenz enters the building. He quickly gathers the tools that he has been sent for and is about to go when he notices a small door in one corner slightly ajar. There seems to be daylight and, from its position, it should open directly onto the garden. So why had he to go through the elaborate business of unlocking the front door to the folly?
Leaving the tools on the floor, he goes to investigate. Eddie is sleeping soundly. It is some time after midnight when he is roused by the knock at his door. It is Florenz, very excited.
I don't know how to explain this. You come with me, I show you. Then you know what happened. You see.
Eddie is reluctant, but Florenz is insistent. They go to the folly. Florenz still has the keys from earlier. They enter and go directly to the little door, having to stoop to pass through. The night air in Arder Street is crystal clear. There is no pollution, and, looking up, one may clearly see the Milky Way. Several things are different. Florenz and Eddie seem now to be wearing different clothes. It is very dark. The air is clear and smells of manure. Eddie speaks. Florenz. No, Edmund, it is Florian. What has happened to your voice, your accent? I really couldn't say. I simply know that when I passed through that doorway, everything changed. We're in a different world. I don't know, different time. Why do you call me Edmund? Because here you are Edmund and I Florian. No longer Florenz Block, but Florian Black. Or Black Florian, said a voice quietly behind them. The voice of Hill Badger, the odious-smelling cellarman from the Frog, the only inn on Arder Street. Do you know me, sir? Not directly, sir, but I know who you are. Hill Badger is the bastard son of the Duke of Esperance, who has refused to recognize him. The Duke had made a modest annuity for Hill's mother, but that ceased when she died. There was no provision for Hill nor provenance of his relationship to the Dupes. He has lived a solitary life, awaiting revenge on the Dupes, and is happy to help the strange one-armed creature who approached him late one evening with just such a proposition. The creature gave him an oddly carved piece of granite, the size of a man's palm, which he is to pass on to a certain Black Florian when he appears. All three repair to the cellar below the Frog to discuss and make plans. Curiously, Hill is the only one who is not puzzled by what has happened. He almost seems prepared for Florenz, so when Florenz avers that he must somehow convince the Duke of Esperance that he is his kinsman, Florian Black, Hill merely says, "But you are fine, sir, you are," and hands him the piece of granite. "You are Black Florian, come to claim that which is yours," and then bites into a very large head of garlic, which he is never without. Finally, after telling them something of the history of the Dupes, and having given Florenz the piece of granite with which he is to identify himself to the Duke of Esperance, Hill counsels Florian to seek the assistance of Mistress Tepper, but declines to accompany them to her establishment. Thus, having consumed several bottles of port, Florian and Edmund present at Tepper's, situated between the Earl of Leicester's garden and Piccadilly. Edmund is apparently known as a poet to a number of the company, and is immediately grafted onto a table of revellers, some of whom are women showing an interest in his more physical attributes. Eddie is gratified. He cannot remember the last time a woman looked at him with carnality in mind. Time to go with the flow, and be what these people want. Meanwhile, Florian has been observed by the Mistress Tepper, who sends a footman to summon him. As he sits at her table, watched by the entire room, she says,
"So, you are back. A man who has once been in London does not stay away for long."
At this moment, Florian made the wisest decision of his life. Since he did not really know or understand what was going on in this world, he decided to keep quiet and let this world show him the way. If he did not know how to answer someone, he remained silent. In this way, most thought him very wise and deep. At around 5:30 in the morning, a substantial breakfast was laid for those who had remained, including the two adventurers. After breakfast, Florian and Edmund made their way across Piccadilly and up Arder Street to Famished Gate at the top end. A little confusion ensued once in the park, for it was much larger than in their own time, and they did not at first find the folly. Then they had to find the little door to one side, which was partially obscured by undergrowth. However, after one failed attempt to return to their own time by way of the main entrance to the folly, Florian realized that they must return by the way they had arrived.
It was Eddie who surmised that they would have to make a copy of the keys to the Folly if they were to return. So Eddie set off to secure the copy, while Florenz went to his accustomed post in the park. For those of you unfamiliar with the geography of the parish of Famishgate, I shall here describe the layout. One of the smallest parishes in London, it is the remains of what was once the family seat of the Dukes of Esperance. What was once the long drive leading to the house, Famishgate, is now Arder Street, which sits like a neat little appendix scar between Piccadilly and what is now Regent's Park. In previous times, much of Arder Street was occupied by people dependent on the House of Esperance for a living or welfare. There was a hostelry, popularly known as the Frog, which was the only one permitted by the Dukes of Esperance. Now, of course, the original grand house of Famishgate has long since disappeared, after it was burnt to the ground in a mysterious conflagration during the Civil War. It has never been entirely clear on whose side the Duke of Esperance was at that time, but it is believed that the family had provided substantial funding to both sides, the only vestige of the original dwelling to survive being the gate at the Piccadilly end of Arder Street. It is interesting to note that the original house was actually round, one of the very few completely round houses in London, if not Europe, and it is thought to have grown out of an original Bronze Age roundhouse dwelling occupied by the family on that site. The building now called Famishgate stands on part of the land once occupied by the first house, although much smaller. It appears to have been a hunting lodge. And so it was that Eddie hit upon the plan for making a substantial sum of money. The registered offices of Zoob Corp. Like beasts of prey hunched over carrion, the plotters rip and tear at the plot to hijack the Esperance fortune. Philip, Lord Plunger of Lucca, or Filthy Lucca, is starting to understand that an evil glint, however evil, will not be sufficient to divert the contents of the Esperance coffers to his own use, and is losing patience with his minions. Just as the Zoob Corp Company secretary is explaining once again that Esperance is bound up tighter than a Japanese girl's foot, the mobile phone of the head of marketing rings. It seemed to all the minions that Lord Plunge might be about to have a fit as Robert, head of marketing, hurries from the room to take the call. At the very least, his tenure at Zoob Corp looked tenuous. Plunge is at his nastiest and most threatening when, 10 minutes later, Robert returns, smiling broadly. He is now in possession of information that will certainly save his sorry little ass, due to his university education, or at least someone he was at university with, the fabled Eddie Valentine. He informs his employer that a friend has come into possession of documents which cast new light on the Esperance fortune. With one more bound. The maitre d' at Infragrante Delictu places menus in the hands of the schemers. Plunge, Robert, marketing, Eddie, and Florenz. "Show me the papers," growls Plunge. Eddie places a folder on the table containing the papers that Florenz had discovered. Plunge paws. "Why have you brought them to me?" "Well, your interest in the Esperance Foundation is well known. We had thought of selling the papers to the Foundation or the British Library or something, but then we discovered a way of linking this Florian Black directly to Florenz." "Which is?" "Well, I'm afraid that I'm not at liberty to divulge that." Plunge poisonously to Robert. "Is this little weasel to be trusted?" Florenz moved so fast that nobody actually saw it. 1 minute listening, and then suddenly he had Plunge by the throat in one of his huge hands. Very quietly, almost dreamily, he says, "I don't speak good, but I listen good. He my friend. You sorry now, or I snap your neck." This is definitely not the sort of restaurant where this sort of thing happens, and there is complete silence as the other diners watch, transfixed and breathless,
like stabbed butterflies. Plunge mutters an apology and waves away the maitre d'. Florenz resumes his seat, smiling broadly. He says, "Florian Black. Black Florian is me." Robert is white-faced and shaking, Eddie bewildered, but Plunge merely smiles back at Florenz and says, "Okay, how are we going to do this?" Florenz beams at Eddie. Indicating the folder, Eddie says that most of the documents deal with mundane household affairs of famished gait. Plunge venomously.
Do I look like the major domo to the Dukes of Esperance?
Eddie, unfazed, continues. However, there is one paper that names a certain Florian Black as heir to the estate.
Who is he?
Well, no one seems to know. He was not the child of that duke, and he seems to have disappeared, while the estate eventually passed to a hill badger, who took the title. Plunge, dripping belladonna.
So why are we here?
Eddie, now confident. Because through this document, waving the Black Florian paper, we can get access to documents that will lead directly to Florenz here, which will give him control of the Esperance Foundation. And if he is your man, Plunge is almost more frightening when smiling.
I believe we may be able to transact some business once you return with incontrovertible proof of title.
Earlier, in a quiet corner of Berks, Outlands, Toynbee shuffles forward among a group of boys into the great hall. He goes to the table where he takes all his meals and, sitting down, takes Baby Howard from his pocket. As soon as he is settled on the lip of Toynbee's side plate, Baby Howard tucks into a hearty breakfast of a cornflake. Mollison, the table captain, speaks first. "I say, Doob, Baby Howard is looking pretty smart today." Everybody at the table is most impressed when Baby Howard explains that he's starting work and wants to look the ticket for his first day. There is an audible intake of breath as Baby Howard goes on to explain that he has a job as assistant to an animal trainer in a circus. The chaps are jolly envious. Toynbee is preoccupied as he eats his breakfast, chewing his scrambled eggs and smoked salmon, and staring straight ahead at the boy opposite. Finally, Plunge, for that is the boy's name, asks what is the matter. Toynbee studies him for a moment before replying. What the devil is he after? Toynbee thinks to himself, as he takes another mouthful of scrambled eggs. "Don't forget me, bro," squeaks Baby Howard. "Smoked salmon is my favourite." Of course it is, and in a trice Toynbee has cut a piece for his brother, placing it on the side plate for the hungry little chap. "Oh, I don't know, Plunge. It's just that I'll miss him, don't you know? See, we've never been apart before." Later that day, Toynbee enters Padbury's study to hear his classics master speaking in a sort of homogeneous horror film Boris Karloff voice. Apparently he is talking to a stuffed Labrador, which he holds under his arm. "Welcome to the vault, sir. This is where the master keeps his memories." Crikey, thinks Toynbee. Sir's pissed again. Padbury places the dog on his desk facing the bust of Caesar, and then, addressing the bust, "Hail, mighty Caesar!" "Yes, sir, a dog." He now moves around to stand before a large picture of the Sacred Heart, which hangs behind the desk, and speaks to the mute saviour. "No, Jack, I didn't buy a dog instead of a shirt. He just followed me home." Felix Padbury is the classics master at the public school attended by our young hero, Outlands. Toynbee has a detention in Padbury's study. Mollison, Plunge, and the others are quite envious of Toynbee, for Padbury's bizarre and unpredictable lectures to his detainees are legend. The lad stands awkwardly, waiting to be berthed for the afternoon. Padbury returns to the conversation with the dog, as Toynbee watches fascinated. "Well, Stoppard, old son, this is home." Felix has not even glanced at our hero since he came in. "Let me introduce you to the boys. This is Jack, the son of God," indicating the poster of the Sacred Heart, "the companion of my youth." Slowly, the two women struggle up the hill,
trying not to spill the soup, which steams in the bucket they carry between them. The rocks on the hillside are loose and shifting. Their sandals do not provide a sure footing. Besides, the older woman is frail and needs support from the younger. The nightmare quality of the journey is defined by its point: to avoid spilling the soup before reaching the crucified man at the top of the hill, and get it to him while still warm. The man they both love. Semtex, the captain of the guard, watches the two women labouring towards him. Strange bastards, these Jews. Two of the men crucified that morning were already dead, but the one in the middle, their bloody Messiah, was still going. He'd made no noise as they banged in the nails. In fact, he appeared to be asleep, almost at rest. Semtex might have supposed that he'd been drugged, which is what usually happened. But no, his eyes were open, alert, and repeating some phrase to himself as he watched the soldiers driving in the nails. As the two women reach him, Semtex stands in their way.
"What have you got there, mother?"
"Some soup."
"A soup?"
"Chicken soup. For my boy. Chicken soup is good. It will help."
"Chicken is soup? Mighty Mars, he's nearly dead. The only thing that's going to help that poor son of a bitch is a sword."
"Please, let us give him some." This from the younger woman. "It couldn't hurt." The man on the cross can, for the first time, see the resemblance between his mother and his girlfriend that everyone always claimed. Funny, he never saw it before. At least they're talking now. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to bring people together.
And beside him, Bert.
Padbury now indicates the large photo of Einstein hanging beside the Sacred Heart. He's Austrian, but he lived in America for a long time. His English isn't that hard. Doesn't matter, though, because he doesn't say an awful lot, really. Just mutters to himself about grand unified theory, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Don't mention quantum mechanics." Padbury turns the dog to face Caesar. "And this, the mighty Caesar." Louder, Stoppard, he's deaf.
"His name is Stoppard, mighty Caesar, and he has nowhere to live." "That's right, he just followed me home."
Toynbee regards the wheels on the dog. Padbury inclines as if listening.
"Well, here I had thought."
He spins to face the Sacred Heart.
"Now then, Jack, he's fully house-trained. There'll be none of that."
Toynbee has been standing for a while now, and realising that Padbury is not going to offer him a seat, goes quietly to the desk in the corner. Felix neither seems to know nor care what the boy does, and continues his conversation with the stuffed dog and his heroes. Felix's heroes are well known to the school. They are his constant companions and feature in most of his activities. But to continue. "Well, I thought it was going to be a candle once." Padbury shakes his head sadly, and Toynbee reflects that Sarah is on good form today, hops notwithstanding. "Oh, yes, we all did my generation. The big baby boom after the war. We grew up during the great street party in the 60s. Suddenly all these yobbo photographers, rock singers and painters were the new aristocracy. And we really thought we had a chance. We really thought we could change the world. I didn't actually want to change the world, but I thought I could at least change my bad luck. You know, not being directly descended from some prick who'd owned a pub 600 years ago and a peer of the realm." Toynbee feels uncomfortable, keenly aware that he is Viscount Yackandander, heir to the Duchy of Esperance, although hostelry played no part in the family fortune. Padbury pats the dog affectionately and glances at Toynbee. "Well, get on, boy, there's plenty to do." Toynbee starts. "Are you all right?" Toynbee had been listening to the basso profundo of a new, singing a jaunty song. He mumbles, "Yes, sir," and immediately submerges in the detention, while Padbury paces about the room, chatting with his posters and the stuffed dog. Toynbee found himself squinting up at the sun. "But more of that anon," continues Padbury. "There is work to be done, a wearable shirt to be found for this evening." He walks to the ironing board under the window. Toynbee watches, following every movement, without moving his head. "That's right, Jack.
Another little dinner à deux with a pure but fetching moniker. It looked to Toynbee as if Sir was actually listening to the dog. Crumbs, Sir's really gone off the deep end this time. Just wait till he tells the others what happened. Pabrin now starts tossing the shirts that cover the ironing board over his shoulder, and they fly around the room like gulls. One lands on Toynbee's head. He doesn't remove it. It's like the endless quest for the Holy Grail. I wonder if good King Arthur felt this frustrated. Another candle. Pabri turns to face the bust of Caesar. Yes, mighty Caesar, you taught him everything he knew, but it doesn't alter the fact that he was a candle. Well, he was sharp enough to learn the value of cavalry and how to beat the mighty Roman Empire. Pabri is so engrossed in his conversation with Caesar that he's quite forgotten the boy, sitting quietly in the corner with a shirt on his head. All right, undisciplined Celts on ponies, but they beat you at your own game, didn't they? The sun squints back at Toynbee. Toynbee dredges his unseen. Oh, it's a great big shame, and if she belonged to me... Crikey, he's singing again. This unseen is going to be a joy. Uncaring of Toynbee as he marks exercises and sings, Felix picks up an exercise book which has an awful familiarity. Plunge. What better way to descend the womb of vicarious living than plunges, sad attempt at Latin? Holding up the offending work to the bust. I'm sorry, mighty Caesar, just have a quick look at this. Julio loves the smell of leather. It is the one thing that tells him that he is back with his beloved men. He likes the company of men. Not the men in the Senate, the pansies in Rome, but the real men that he commands. Julio is a soldier, and deals uneasily with the semantic business of the Senate. But here in camp, he is comfortable, surrounded by horses, centurions bellowing orders, and men laughing and shouting as they go about the business of being soldiers. Julio's men admire and respect the leader who has taken Rome to the world, while they brought the world back to Rome. The camp is more alive because he's here. It's not just the special dinner that they will have tonight with their leader, whom they have not seen in 18 months. Julio, Magister, has brought his own cook from Gaul to direct the cooking of food for the feast, and everyone is most excited, for the cooking of Paulus Bocchus is legend. Finally, the horn is sounded for the evening meal, and 2,000 of the most disciplined fighting men in the world take their places. Before the feast begins, Julio delivers a short address to his men, opening with a gag about the duo Sinestri sitting in deck chairs. When he gets to cogito, I'll leave it out, there is a roar of approval. They love him. In keeping with Julio's simple tastes, they start with asparagus in hollandaise sauce. A bread fight breaks out among the Iberians, but it is over before the linguine and smoked salmon are served. During this course, a Nubian slave runs in with a message for the great man. Julio gives him a cup of wine, another instance of his common touch, then reads it carefully and scribbles Sine Nobilitas on the back. Felix shakes his head sadly as he regards the bust. Aye, it lacks nobility. Good God, Plunge, we seem to have plumbed new depths. Guy Fawkes's confession was more legible than this. After the thumbscrews. Made more sense too. Still, your handwriting nicely suits your random approach to the subject, as if a spider had fallen into a bottle of ink, then taken a stochastic stroll across a blank sheet of paper. Should have been left blank. It's wrong, isn't it, lad? All bloody wrong. Because you never listen, do you, boy? But I shan't need Latin when I left school, sir. No, but you need it now, lad, because you're still here, aren't you? So write it all out again, and as a bonus, make it legible. Toynbee is going to be the star of 4B when they hear about this. Toynbee and the sun are now winking at each other, unruly fools. Felix holds up a shirt triumphantly. Look at this, lads, a clean shirt. And I haven't got Judas doing my laundry, have I, Jack? Anyway, it's clean enough for tonight. No burn marks. Here he holds his sartorial nugget, the shirt, under the nose of the stuffed dog. See? Doesn't smell too bad. At this point it seemed to Felix that the boy Doob had been transformed into a seagull, or, at the very least, disappeared and been replaced by one. Really, Jack? Judas did the cooking as well as the washing? Mind you, I have to say you all look very well turned out in all the pictures. I suppose Judas did the washing up after the Last Supper as well. Toynbee watches Felix taking in Jack's reply. By now the boy is barely breathing. Say it isn't so. Chinese takeaway? Does rather lack moment, wouldn't you say? Toynbee is hungry. A nice piece of raw herring would do the trick. In another part of Toynbee's youth, Toynbee watches his father carefully. He can't be sure, but the old Duke seems a little less hale than hitherto. There is a shade of hesitation in his voice.
Doobs go back in a straight line for close to 50,000 years. We have observed quantum change during that time. Indeed, we have been part of it. But you see, my boy, we are not part of all that Cro-Magnon claptrap. Doob needs no titles to remind us who we are or what we are worth. You will be Esperance after me, but will first be Doob.
Baby Howard stirred fitfully in his sleep, and Toynbee put his hand in his pocket to stroke his brother's chest with his finger. Today, as always, the old Duke is wearing a kimono, one of nearly 1,500 that he possesses, and as the old progenitor shifts in his seat, the front falls open slightly, revealing to Toynbee a large tattoo of a peregrine falcon on the old Duke's chest. The falcon winks at him as it is revealed. Our young hero is fascinated. Some time passes, with nothing said. Then the Duke stands and walks to the door of the library, motioning Toynbee to follow. He leads the young scion down to the cellars. Toynbee rarely comes down here. It is dark and cool. There is nothing here except bottles of wine and the detritus of a large house. Finally the Duke halts before a large wooden door which is bolted. He unbolts the door and enters a small empty chamber cut into rock. Taking up a metal rod which is propped in a corner, he inserts it into a fissure in the rock opposite the door and manipulates it. In amazement, Toynbee watches one entire wall of the chamber start to swing back slowly, revealing another vast chamber.
This is the family library, my boy. You will find here all the treasures of the Doobs. You will also find here all your ancestors.
But what about
the family crypt? Empty. No Doob was ever buried there. This is our place. Our place. We've been here for something like 50,000 years, and we're all buried here. I shall be put here when my time comes, as shall you. The land does not only belong to Doob, it is Doob. The only Doob not buried here is Black Florian.
Toynbee looks questioningly at his father, but is unsure whether to speak. The old Duke looks back, then smiles. Why isn't...
He is not dead. He is gone from this life, but he is not dead. Look around. Take your time, my boy. There is much to see.
Toynbee has never seen anything like it. Books, paintings, shoes, a carriage, ornaments, clothing, weapons, jewellery, implements and orrery, anything Toynbee has ever conceived of, and many things that he does not recognise. It isn't until he has been looking among the treasures for a couple of hours that Toynbee notices the most curious thing of all. The walls are covered in markings and designs. The Duke is lying on a sort of daybed, reading, when Toynbee approaches with his question, carried like a dead mouse in his jaws. The Duke looks at his son.
You wish to know about the cave walls? It's very simple. The cave painting is the history of Doob, made by our ancestors before records were kept. No one knows of this place or what it contains except the Doob. Did you see a mark like a two-pronged fork? Yes, sir, it's everywhere.
That is a tine, the mark of the family. I have it here. It was given me by my father when his time came, as I to you when it is my time.
Here, holding out a piece of granite for Toynbee to inspect.
This has the family mark carved on it. The stone comes from the beginning of the family. There is only one other like it. It is held by the other branch of the family in Europe, so that we may know one another when we meet.
Again, Toynbee is amazed. He never suspected another branch of the family.
The story of the great fight is on the wall somewhere, and when I am gone, you will be able to understand it.
Without warning and incidental sound effects, the Duke of Esperance became a carapace. Toynbee, who had glanced momentarily out the window, returned his gaze to his father, the empty, dead husk of his father. As Toynbee had looked away, his governor had slipped out, and the boy had missed it. Missed the moment of parting. Sitting in the same position, the old Duke's features were relaxed in death, the eyes open. In fact, he didn't seem dead, merely asleep. Except his eyes were open. Toynbee almost laughed at the slightly quizzical, rather idiotic look death had given the old man, and then he did laugh at the irony of having looked away at the moment, the precise moment, and missed it. In 30 years of conversing with his father, Toynbee's eyes had never left his face, and they were today, as always, firmly in their sockets, skulking beneath the eyebrows. As he dived into the inevitable pool of oblivion, the old one had taken the last 30 years with him. Toynbee is now Esperance. His Grace, Toynbee, goes down to the family library. His father, the previous Grace, had shown Toynbee where he was to be put when the time came, and our hero has gone to have another look and get the wheelbarrow that he will use to transport his father to the final resting place, the Pit of Doob. There is nothing special about the wheelbarrow. It is merely a vehicle for transporting bodies. Another would do as well. As Toynbee entered the cavern, he heard a cacophony of voices talking, which was most odd, since his father had told him that no person knew or had ever known of its existence outside the immediate family. He looked around, searching for all these people that he could hear. Nothing to be seen, nothing untoward. As he gets closer to the pit, the voices grow louder, and he can start to make out some words. Finally, clear as a bell, he hears the voice of his dead father very near.
I am with my people now, my darling, and you will be with us too when your time comes. You will now be able to understand the family history and the paintings on the cave walls.
What had been a meaningless jumble of designs and images now resolved itself into a clear and coherent story, as if he'd worked out how to look at one of those dreadful 3D pictures. In a cave, Toynbee learns the history of the Doob. Fosson returns from the hunt, more crazed than anyone has hitherto seen him. His dray is all but empty. He is raving, gesticulating, and indicating Toch's camp. Nobody understands what has happened, but Fosson is very angry. He seems to be blaming Toch's camp, and in the midst of his seething anger, stops to defecate. Fosson wishes to attack Toch's group, wants his group to back him. Well, frankly, nobody is keen at first. For one thing, open physical confrontation between groups is quite rare, costly in human terms, and rarely achieves the desired result. Besides, nobody clearly understands what has got Fosson so worked up. Finally, however, Fosson prevails. After all, with Fosson at their head, how can they fail? And then Toch's group is prosperous. There are things to be had. And finally, there are females in Toch's group. They need fresh females to breed with. Ultimately, the group agrees to back Fosson. They are more scared of Fosson than Toch's group. The battle is hard and marked with the deep, sharp bitterness of brothers. Men are butchered, dismembered, and weep for themselves and what they do. Finally, as Fossen violates his sister after disfiguring her, she buries her axe in his back, and he rolls off her, in great pain and almost immobile. Gushing blood from her violated vagina, she hacks off Fossen's hands. The fighting has stopped now, and both groups stand watching as she hacks at her brother. Cousins, sons, and uncles watch her silently, intent, as she finally renders her twin harmless. Calmly facing the fighters, she tells them that it is now over, and those that must shall take Fossen away. After the departure of Fossen and his small band, Toch took the name of her father. In this manner was created the Doob. Plunge as Torquemada. Robert has been called to recount the progress of the plan to hijack the Esperance coffers. It is early in the day, and his blue chin matches his blue suit, while both are echoed by the bags under his eyes. Plunge is at his most infernal prior to mid-morning, and Robert is frankly cowed by the festering package of malevolence demanding progress. His mouth twitches in a sort of nervous pout, as if he is blowing kisses at his uncertain future. For the first time in his career, he faces the possibility of dismissal. Lord Plunge was clear. If Robert had not come up with a plan to garnish the Esperance loot, he might have continued unnoticed within Zoop Corp. As it is, he has made himself a target. If the gamble pays off, rewards without number. If not, disemboweling would be an attractive option. Robert considers the pros and cons. On the plus side, the small group of faceless men who govern the Esperance Foundation do not have a reputation for creativity or corporate infighting, whereas Plunge does. Robert takes comfort from this, while still having misgivings concerning the unreliability of Eddie Valentine, not to mention that all but incoherent East European gypsy he has in tow. Eddie has been altogether too circumspect. Plunge expects a detailed, bullet-pointed progress report, and all Robert has been able to provide is the assurance that a process is underway that will secure documents giving incontrovertible proof of title to Florence, who will then act on Plunge's instructions. In the face of the plague of words that Plunge is lobbing at him, Robert gamely points out that the only possible hitch in the plan at the moment would be the emergence of the current Duke, Toynbee, to take control of the Foundation and fight back. And as they both know, that is unlikely to happen. Plunge's face relaxes in a grimace of pleasure, and Robert's panting subsides. Elsewhere, in the environs of Fetter Grange, Toynbee's doppelganger was about to get it in the neck. Hooligan, the ancient social worker, with the wizened face and the toothless grin, chuckled and put down his knitting, then turned to Tex and said, "We're aiming to have a necktie party, and you're going to be the guest of honor." Tex swallowed, perhaps for the last time. The orderly gathering of ranchers, cowhands, and computer analysts turned suddenly ugly. Well, the computer boys had always been fairly unattractive. A bright-eyed boy moved through the crowd selling chalk ices for a dime. Oh, how Tex wished he had a dime. His throat was really dry. Cuban heel whinnied softly as a rope was tossed over the branch above Tex's head, and people congratulated the Boy Scout who tied it on his excellent knot. And now we come to the part of our story which was to prove a turning point for the lovely Palomino. A small child had been stroking Cuban Heel's muscle, and now offered the mare a lick of his chalk ice. Cuban Heel was transported. She had never realized that life could be so beautiful, so meaningful. All concern for her troubled master evaporated with one slurp. She was never to be the same again, hereafter referring to herself as Gloria and always affecting a cigarette holder. Tex took one last look at his beloved prairie. Oh, how he wished he was back at sea. Suddenly, the proceedings came to a halt as a voice cried out,
"Wait!"
It was that tutelary saint, Ruby, the sultry saloon singer, just in the nick of time. But Ruby was not alone, for at her side stood Captain Blackjack Thatcher and Boris the Georgian Giant. Ignoring Tex's request for a dime, Ruby argued long and eloquently for Tex's life, as Boris and Blackjack moved silently through the crowd, slitting throats. Talking of Ruby, did I mention the night that Charlie got drunk and told her about the aliens? He never told anyone else, just Ruby, and she knew they had been looking for her. Mind you, she didn't tell Charlie that. It didn't seem to concern him somehow. And she knew they'd be back. She would meet them. In the back of her mind, there was some thought of an unaffected cowboy hero, but it wasn't clear to her how he fitted in all this. Who the hell is Tex? Extracts from Toynbee's Oz Journal. On a day as warm and moist as a sports sock, Demonic, Stefan, et alia are standing in the driveway outside my window playing their version of pétanque. There is some noise and much swigging of Pernod. Silver balls are propelled through the air by the players' lungs. The little piggy lies snug on the gravel, untroubled by the cannonade, while I, snug in my bed, untroubled by all but the exploring hands of Ruby. The thought of joining the lads in the driveway has been tumbling about the back of my mind for some minutes, and I have been inspecting it closely, seeking some final motivation, not a cracker. There is to be no respite from the attentions of my lover and her ally, my libido. Oh dear. The voice of Reed Cherry, divested of his hackney for another day, rumbles under the heat. Still insufficient. After all, his hearing is not until next week, so I can talk to him later. Besides, Ruby has roused the sleeping giant, the mighty bladder of learning, and it must have a sacrifice. We work quickly, for Ruby has soon to return to her husband. I'm buggered if I know why. He's the most complete churl since creatures learned to breathe out of water. I cannot believe that he has ever been with Ruby, done with her the things that I am doing now, nor treat her as he does, had they been together like this, just once. But no, that's not right. I have trouble with the concept of anyone behaving as he does. And then she defends him. God almighty, she actually defends him. She tells me of his disgusting behaviour as if describing something normal, the actions of a rational person. And then when I suggest that he's a pig, she continues to defend him, which is exactly why I love her. She's kind and forgiving. All the while there's a little voice tucked away out of sight, echoing down my cortex. What is she doing with you, boy? I don't know. What is she doing with me? Well, sex is part of it. Well, not perhaps the major part, but surprisingly more than is fashionable. I'm nobody's idea of a good catch, or the dream lover. After all, I fit too well with the damaged souls that infest this place, that shall do nothing, be remembered for nothing. Esperance will end with me, at the ancestral home. Famished Gate, the house where I grew up, occupied by all those things which don't quite work, but nobody's got around to repairing yet. Indeed, I'm one of them. Pain is largely a matter of anticipation. And when I go, there shall be no place in the pit of doom for me. I am the last that knows of its existence. There is nobody left to wheel me down to join my clan in our barrow, as I did my father. Maybe I shall wander like Black Florian. I might even run into him somewhere. I believe he's in Deauville. That'd be nice.
Ha ha ha, Black Florian.
Or more precisely, Florian Black. Or so he said the first time society recalls having seen him in London. He appeared one evening late in 1752 at Tepper's, the coffee house just south of Piccadilly, where he turned all heads. Improbably handsome, simply but elegantly dressed in a style reminiscent of the Puritans of the previous century, and reserved to the point of boorishness. He was, however, no boor, a man of few words perhaps, but witty and amusing when he chose to speak, mysterious and quite charming. In contrast with the lecherous, womanizing sots that infested the coffee houses and salons of London at that time, indeed, he was never seen to take strong drink in public. Why, I go to coffee houses to take coffee. The evening on which Mr. Black arrived at Tepper's the first time, he was in the company of Edmund Valentine, the dwarf of Arder Street. While Florian may not have taken strong drink that evening, Edmund certainly had, and appeared to have accounted for Florian's share as well. Some time after, it was rumoured that the two had been seen in the company of Hill Badger. Badger, of course, had not presented at Tepper's with the two blades, nor would have gained entry, being foul of aspect and odour. The surprising part of that night being the time that Florian spent conferring with Mistress Annie Tepper, the luscious but usually unapproachable proprietor of said establishment. He was overheard inquiring after the Dubes, now Dukes of Esperance. It may be that Mistress Tepper was surprised at Florian's apparently patchy knowledge of the foremost family in Europe, but she evidently agreed to assist Florian in his endeavours. And what might they have been? Florian, despite his lack of knowledge concerning the family Dube, convinced Mistress Tepper that he was a long-lost relation of the Dubes. I have no doubt that it was Florian's possible entitlement to a substantial portion of the family fortune that engaged the venal Mistress Tepper, and she agreed to effect a meeting with Ignace, the current Duke of Esperance. There is no argument more convincing than greed. Thus it begins. Prairie-wise. With one bound, Tex eased back in the saddle. Cuban Heel, now Gloria, shifted her cigarette holder and whinnied softly. It was going to be a good night. The cowboy hero was unsure how to take the latest developments. Things had always been unpredictable, but now there was something else, an air of unreality. Tex looked at the letter again. It was a puzzle for the simple, unaffected cowboy hero, since not only could he not read, he knew none who could write either. Of course, Gloria could read, but she was only able to communicate numbers. How Tex would have laughed had he known that the letter in question came from Mr. Palfreman, secretary to the trustees of the Esperance Foundation. The illiterate cowpoke squinted at the incomprehensible writing. It was all Dutch to him, another language with which he was unfamiliar. Gloria coughed. She was coughing a lot lately, and Tex was becoming worried. He tried to persuade her to take up Turkish cigarettes to no avail, and had taken to placing a vaporizer in her stable at night. If only she would get out more, instead of spending all day sorting catgut. And he still didn't like the look of that ornery social worker. Why, it ain't natural for a fellow to spend so much dang time knitting. Oh, how Gloria wished something would happen. Later that night, Robin was re-examining the letter from Palfreman. It was most puzzling to receive a chain letter in this god-forsaken place, especially one that contained such a curious chain. The now benevolent Baron took the chain from Robin's lap and looked at it closely. Robin's lap. This is like no metal I have ever seen. In fact, I don't believe it was made on this planet. What makes you say that? Queried Robin pleasantly. In the background could be heard roars of laughter from Robin's cheerful chaps, who were still intent upon the new scientist. Here, look here where it says, made in the People's Republic of Alpha Centauri. Yes, there is that, breathed the fabled woodsman. And here, where it says sole importers Booz and Milne, Great Weasel Street, London. And look at this, my old love, interrupts the hero in green. Maison lettre au château. Most curious. Do you know this Palfreman? The Baron was on the edge of his seat. Stay with us as life goes on still. Toynbee steps along Great Weasel Street with a jaunty air. He is in love, unconditionally. Nothing will seem half so bad on this glorious day. Suddenly, he sees Mr. Palfreyman, the Trust Secretary, coming towards him. It has been some time since they met, and Toynbee is surprised to see Palfreyman making directly for him. "It is most urgent that we speak, Your Grace. There has been a development concerning the trust." Toynbee is baffled. How can he have anything to do with the trust? And how did they find him? Palfreyman takes our hero for coffee and explains the impending takeover by Zoob Corp. He goes on to explain that he is convinced that there is some sort of trick involved and that Plunge has produced an apparent heir to the Esperance fortune. Surely Toynbee can do something. Toynbee has not been down to the family cellar since the death of his father, but he feels that he might find the answer there. He promises to try and find a solution, but makes Palfreyman promise not to tell anyone about having seen him. The tinkle of the bell as Toynbee enters Booze and Milne. At Fetter Grange. Toynbee has become more hollow. Well, not exactly more hollow. He wasn't hollow to start with. He was solid, densely packed, firm, no relief, no contours. But now the interior has been eaten away, eroded by, was not sure by what really. Now there is a big hollow cavern, with tapering stalactites of unexpected passion, on which the unwary might snag themselves. He didn't used to be complex. He used to be dead simple, just a quietly amorphous drunk of limited emotions. But every buffet contributed to the stalactites, and he wound up with a ringing cavern of dangerous passions. He did most of it himself. He refused to do this and that. He wanted to pursue this path or the other. He wouldn't be told. And he came out of each round just a little more behind, always chasing the original stake. He never dreamt the original stake was the one through his heart. He knows who is to blame, of course. It wasn't the aged Duke of Esperance, his father, nor the mother he never knew. He could not have been more loved or lucky. No one could have been, I'm sure. And that is the stumbling block. Not that he is loved or lucky, but that he knows he is, even used it, uses it still. He hates himself, but sometimes has no idea that he's doing it, and is resented for that by all the miserable fractions of humanity who have to work hard just to avoid being despised. They cannot forgive him for not appreciating just how lucky he is. God knows he is lucky, just so miserable as well. He needs someone to hold him, someone to succor, someone whose mouth looks like it had been applied with a razor blade, and will whisper in his ear, "It's all right, babe. I'll never leave you." Is that you, Ruby? But then, suddenly, Toynbee is surrounded by demons, although he can't see them unless they laugh. Everything is pitch black until a demon laughs, and then a brilliant flash of light illuminates the laughter. But he can hear them, demons chattering to each other happily, touching each other, some dancing, and as a demon laughs, there is a supernova of light, illuminating just that demon, nothing else. That demon giggling and its eyes crinkled up with pleasure. Then he sees the laughing demon, and is cherished for that moment. It is lovely, and he starts to feel quite cheerful after a while. I hope he can find these demons again sometime. They make him so happy. He wants to laugh like that too. The story so far. With one bound, Toynbee gears up, preparing the fiction which Doc Skittle seems to need so desperately. Dear Doc, you will recall that in our last thrilling instalment, Tex had won the biggest poker hand of his life, and now the tough but kindly Jake Plunge and his gang of desperadoes is after him. But things are not as black as they seem for our young hero. Ruby, the kind-hearted saloon singer, is hiding Tex in her comfortably appointed suite back at the hotel. Almost no one knows of Tex's safe haven. Almost no one, that is. An officer from the DSS nearly discovers Tex after being tipped off by the dastardly Wild Bill Skittle, owner of the Plugged Nickel, a run-down gambling saloon and private hospital on the outskirts of town. Ruby of the Kind Heart conducts her travails there night after night, giving her all for the scurvy dogs that frequent the port. Many's the night the sensitive saloon singer has run crying from the room. It's not all gravy, you know, being a saloon singer. Perhaps a word here about our heroine, Ruby Lunch, might be appropriate. Ruby emerged after a grueling 8-hour sprint down the birth canal into the world, and sneezed. The world, or its representatives on this occasion, chorused, "Bless you," and Ruby smiled. They all saw her. The tiny, bloodied W.C. Fields doll had actually smiled, a real smile. Not the grimace of wind, but a look containing intent. The world's deputies were charmed, and Ruby was blessed. Looking down between her breasts, at the tiny parcel of jeans lying on her stomach, Ruby's mother, Charity, whispered, "Why, she's only a skerrick." But she knew things this skerrick, having listened to the world and its doings for 9 months. After all, there isn't a great deal to do in the womb, the only compulsory task being the somersault in preparation for leaving. That wasn't too difficult. Awkward, but not difficult. So Ruby found herself with a little time on her hands, and occupied herself listening to the outside world and tried to make sense of it. Of course, it was hard trying to imagine a world that she had never seen, so she spent her time practicing the words she heard. The ever-resourceful Ruby persevered. There was something to do. Initially, she was not sure how to make the sounds, but with practice, she managed to get them sounding quite good. Of course, she had no idea what any of the sounds meant. Anyhow, simply plenty of time to try them out. And she did too, with arresting results. On Ruby's second day out, the nurse dropped something and cursed involuntarily. In a very small, clear voice, Ruby said,
"Oh dear."
The nurse looked slack-jawed at Charity, as Chaz, equally slack-jawed, gazed back. Neither spoke, and then they both looked at Ruby. After a while, Charity said, as matter-of-factly as possible,
"What did you say, dear?"
But answer came there none, since Ruby had no idea what had been said to her. With repetition, she understood that certain expressions and tones of voice elicited particular responses, and she had responded appropriately to the curse, but without comprehension. That would come soon enough, sadly. At 16, Ruby was pregnant. At 17, she gave birth to her son, Paris. Although the birth was relatively easy at only 3 hours, the pain was a smack in the face for her. She was on her own because her mother was working. Her father was out getting pissed, and the father of the child had moved away. Besides, she hadn't told him. Most of her friends got pregnant that year, but then most of them had married the fathers and embarked upon careers as baby factories. That's what Ruby called them. Ruby was rather disturbed by the whole experience, and although she was delighted and relieved that Paris was so perfect, she decided at that moment she would not be trapped. She wasn't going to spend her life stumbling between the supermarket checkout and the maternity ward, covered in blood and puke. Ruby made an extraordinary recovery and signed herself out of the hospital that afternoon. Then, with Paris, caught the bus home. When her mother returned from her cleaning job, Ruby asked if she would mind Paris, then went into town and signed on for the course in sultry saloon singing at university, the start of her glorious, if checkered, career. However, Tex's many years on the prairie have left him alert, and he manages to give the keen DSS officer the slip. In that world which constitutes reality for the rest of us miserable souls. Ignace, Duke of Esperance, throws the dice, and as they tumble about the board, he regards his guests. Of course, he knows Annie Tepper of old. It is rumoured that they were lovers in their youth, and although not having met Florian Black previously, he finds him familiar, as if there is a family recognition. The little piece of granite with the family marking serves to confirm Florian's claim of kinship. Glancing at the double six which now lays on the backgammon board, he considers the third member of the party, Edmund Valentine,
a poetaster and drunkard. I am without issue, and it is most timely that you sought me out, Florian. Now I may secure the family fortune in the hands of a kinsman.
Florenz reveals nothing through hooded eyes. Eddie nudges Florenz under the table, and Florenz speaks.
Then how, sir, shall we give provenance to my claim? Naturally, I shall have a paper drawn by my lawyers, naming you as my heir, and you shall have this as proof of title upon my death.
Annie Tepper very quietly says,
providing you have no natural child of your own.
Both Eddie and Florenz think of Hill Badger.
I have no expectation of such a thing.
That very same evening, Ruby finds out from Wild Bill Skittle that a big cattle drive is passing close to town, and Tex, seeing a window of opportunity, decides to approach the trail boss for a job. The moon is high over the prairie, and a light evening breeze fanned his face as Tex considered the musical qualities of the prairie at night. When he gets out to the herd, Tex discovers that the trail boss is none other than the legendary Robert Woolbed, well-known gastronome and travel writer. The two sit up late into the night, discussing Japanese cuisine around the campfire. Many the witty thrust and parry concerning sashimi between the two new chums. Tex may have found a way out of his predicament, if only Robert wasn't quite so tactile. Whoosh! The sun hangs like a fridge magnet, hammering down relentlessly on the back of Toynbee's sensitive English neck as the 12-year-old aristocrat sits quietly in a corner of the saloon somewhere in Berkshire, cradling baby Howard in his hand. Two cowpokes, still dusty from the prairie, play backgammon and sip Campari. Two raw-boned farm boys are having a spitting competition, their straw-coloured hair matching their straw-coloured eyes and their straw-coloured fingernails. Abilene is a wonderful town, thought Toynbee, and, as if he had heard him, baby Howard looked up into his eyes. "I wish we were there," he piped. Toynbee gazed down fondly at his older brother, cradled in the palm of his hand, and wondered at all the energy contained in this 3-inch human dynamo. Toynbee had been present when baby Howard had made his first appearance and crawled from his mother's vagina. He had watched fascinated as his brother, then less than an inch long, crawled hand over hand up his mother's belly toward the breasts full of milk. Now the two brothers are inseparable, as are the two breasts. Well, that's enough history, I think. Time we return to what the trustees amusingly call the real world. Toynbee's Australian Journal. It was in Punt Road that Ruby's throat began playing the overture to her orgasm, as Tex's tongue coaxed the nascent bud of sexuality from its copse of concealment. He looked at her with eyes full of promise, and she was seduced by her ambition, then abandoned. Not a bad start.
Jesus, Tex, I was asleep.
I'm writing, Ruby.
Well, it's inconvenient. 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm fast asleep, and suddenly I'm coming.
I'm bloody writing.
Why can't it be Valerie or Harry or Charlotte?
Ah, Charlotte.
Bugger off, just come to bed. Do it in the morning.
I'll forget.
Why can't you just make notes on cigarette packets like other writers?
Let me tell you, boys, life is never easy, never quiet, never dull, never rich, never jolly, never without pause. Besides, I don't smoke cigarettes. The knife-edged sound of Demonic's Louisiana Zydeco music is scratching at the wall between our rooms. Joli blonde, joli blonde. White, 21, raised in Bacchus Marsh, Victoria, and he has a collection of Zydeco CDs that would make blind Freddy weep with envy. A CD player, I hear you bleat? Is Demonic not receiving the government grant? Yes, but he was not always unemployed. The CDs are witness to a fortune pissed away. Before Ruby has returned from the lavatory, our hero slips aside to source the spliff that invariably accompanies the music. Keith, the grim hedonist, glares at Tex from Demonic's door, a man of wealth and fame. Demonic, the boy hero, is still in the process of strapping up the number as Tex arrives.
Dear boy, on another occasion you could be better prepared and have that wee thing strapped up in pre-ignition mode before disturbing my evening inspection of the inside of my shell. Gonads, Tex, are you contributing? As you well know. Put up or shut up. The now completed vehicle of illegal substance is passed to Tex for sparking. It was after listening to Billy Connolly for the second time, or maybe it was the third time, that Tex became aware of the new day, staining the blackness of the night. Slowly, making codger noises in his chest, Tex stands. Demonic remains comatose in front of the moving wallpaper with its bent coat-hanger aerial. The slow progress back to Tex's room is impaled by the sight of the ubiquitous Reed Cherry, home after a night full of drunks and prostitutes in the back of his taxi. Top of the morning, sir. And good morning to you, sir, you fine gentle person. Good night? Average. I got a fair to Sunbury, but I came back empty. Called in at Tulla and hung around on the rank for an hour. Nothing doing, no flights. Still, Sunbury was something. Yeah. If you're around later, I'll give you a game. Where, cat and budgie? The same. Can't and barred. D&D? Well, I was the worse for wear, but I had found it necessary to discipline a larrikin. He was with friends, more like known associates, really. Anyway, there was a general affray. What, worse than the bouncer's revenge? Oh, my word, yes. These chaps didn't appear to be familiar with the concept of capitulation. The jacks were called upon several times, but wisely stayed out of it. Sounds entirely churlish. Sadly, I was held responsible, and the proprietors acted accordingly. But then, at Fetter Grange, the sax player bobs and weaves to duck the rhythm, disguised as melody, that explodes from his instrument. This action is necessary when engaged upon a recital of the full 14 hours of Ricky Wagner's Ringpool Cycle, now recognized as a highly dangerous piece of music. The music world is polarized in its view of Wagner. Some feel that his early work with Jan and Dean is peerless, while others believe that his Ringpool Cycle is his Meisterwerk. And then, of course, there is a small band of Tonkinnik who reckon that a sax player is just a salivating muser. Meanwhile, in Toynbee's reality, with one bound, Tex's face was illuminated in the warm, ghostly glow from the spaceship. Gloria, Tex's horse, whinnied softly as the extraterrestrials emerged from the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod of the spacecraft. And again, something stirred in the leafy green-blue shadows of the saloon. A man mountain, one of the range which stretches across the Midwest, stood and looked around. Mighty Shea, for it was he, was bigger even than the Russian émigré Boris Tchaikovsky, but, alas, myopic. He strained his eyes in search of the bar. Soon the whole room was pointing and calling advice. Unfortunately, not all the patrons were pointing in the direction of the sought facility, and Mighty's confusion grew as the calling reached a cacophony. A fight had broken out between the farm boys and some horse dealers. The bartender started to discharge a pistol in the air. Without warning, Mighty Shea fell like a giant sequoia, and the saloon shook as he hit the floor, while those patrons who were still able gathered around the gaping hole in the barroom floor to look down at Mighty, lying in the middle of the dance floor of the disco below. People were dancing around the prone figure of the man mountain as a handsome young couple sat in the small of Mighty's back, locked in a passionate embrace. Suddenly, the sounds of the disco died away, as a familiar figure dressed in green hose and leather jerkin, worn over a black shirt stylishly open to the navel, which revealed a heavy gold chain with medallion and a very hairy Ronnie! Stepped to the edge of the dance floor. A merry twinkle gleamed in Robin's eye as he raised his longbow and faced Dennis, the Sheriff of Nottingham. The sun glinted on Dennis's tin star. For a moment, the universe stood still. Nevertheless, the captain of the long, gleaming, throbbing
silver pod of the spacecraft, for it was none other, extended his slimy green hand to lightly touch Tex's forehead, and then began thought communicating with him, for that was the way of it in his ancient civilization. The little green men from beyond Alpha Centauri were seeking Ruby, the kind-hearted saloon singer. Their search had brought them more than halfway across the known universe. In fact, for the second time. The first time they got here, Ruby was only 3. I'm afraid that Quattle isn't much of a timekeeper. Still, at least they met Charlie Lunch, Ruby's dad. What could these frogs in space boots want with the sultry saloon singer? What perils had they faced on their epic voyage? A voyage conducted entirely without lemons. And why does the dastardly Wild Bill Skittle mark his socks left and right? Many are the untold stories of the open prairie and outer space. Tex pondered these things as he thought communicated with the diminutive green leader of the extraterrestrials. The spaceman grew impatient with Tex's wandering thoughts, for he had travelled long and far on his quest for Ruby. Quattle, for it was he, was tired and dusty, and he needed a stiff drink. Tex offered Quattle, named after his maternal grandfather, Quattle not Tex, a swig of bourbon and coke, with a slice of lemon floating in it, from his canteen. At long last lemon, thought Quattle. Perhaps Ruby held the key to the secrets of the universe. Perhaps Ruby held the key to the dastardly Wild Bill Skittle. Maybe Tex held the key to the solitary saloon singer. Is there a key to unlock the mind of Sean Hooligan? Why does Doc Skittle wear surgical rubber gloves in therapy? Why the long face? With one bound, Tex was free. Life goes on. Free. With one bound, Tex was still. With one life, Tex was bound. Still free. With one Tex goes one Tex. With free still bound. Can I get a witness? Witness, witness. Fetter Grange again. But then, with one bound, spray from the bow of the tall ship laughed in Tex's face. Of course, Tex was more comfortable astride Cuban heel, roaming his beloved prairies, but this was an adventure. Captain Thatcher, blackjack to her men, was on the poop. God, or Bernie, was in his heaven, and all was right with the world. Gee, it makes a chap feel good, Tex thought, to be under the control of chaps like Blackjack Thatcher. The telex in the mess below deck was clicking and clacking in solitary conversation, and taking the concept of nirvana into previously uncharted waters. It must be lonely being a telex at sea, Tex thought, especially since so many mariners are without basic literacy skills. Tex looked across at the DSS officer, who was being seasick over the side of the ship. The young whippersnapper was finding the voyage rather rough, and wishing that someone from social work had gotten the assignment instead. The hell with the glory. Very little of his training had prepared him for this, and now he wished that he hadn't been so eager. But Davenport, for this was the whippersnapper's given name, set his jaw and shot his cuffs, determined to see it through to the end. His cuffs lay dead at his feet. Still on board the good ship Fetter Grange. Suddenly there was a cry from the lookout in the crow's nest. "There's no sugar in my dang-blasted tea again," and all eyes strained in the direction indicated. Then, without warning, a giant tentacle reached over the side of the ship and grasped the startled DSS officer by the throat. There was something disturbingly familiar about this tentacle. The giant squid, coincidentally named Barry, raced through the turbulent waters of the restless ocean, still clutching Davenport. Oh, God, how he hated all this. He would much rather be hunched over his word processor, for Barry was a trained journalist and lived his squalid life by facts. Suddenly, one of Davenport's spurs became entangled in a drift net, and the terrified DSS officer was wrenched violently from Barry's grasp. Oh well, thought the squid, there are plenty more DSS officers in the sea. Many frustrating months passed, as Davenport tossed and turned in his bed at the Plugged Nickel, traumatised by the loss of his leg. Tex thought often of the sweet, vulnerable DSS officer, wondering what had befallen him, wondering how much of the blame lay with his parents, the state education system, the coffee shops in Bond Street. Wild Bill Skittle, the dastardly Zeitgeist, in fact Zeitgeist is his middle name, thought often of Ruby, and sometimes of Cuban Heel, the loveliest palomino he had ever known. Ruby, the sultry saloon singer with the milky white breasts and the blood-red nose, a nose that men would gladly die for. Older viewers will remember the riots of 1865 in St. Louis. Thought often too, but nothing seemed to come out. No matter how hard she cogitated, except the image of a giant squid's tentacle with the legend LMCT tattooed on it. What can it mean? Is the squid related to the dastardly Wild Bill Skittle? Will Davenport ever dance in competition again? Can Cuban Heel ever get over her mal de mer? Do-lang, do-lang, do-lang. Keep reading for these and more questions. Meanwhile, Boris Tchaikovsky, the Georgian giant, turned slowly to face Tex. His motion reminded Tex of the interminable, deliberate slide of a Welsh slag heap into the peaceful sleeping valley below. The crowd was becoming restless as the two fighters circled each other, for the crowd knew nothing of Wales. All at once there was an unexpected hush as Boris drew himself up to his full height of 14 feet, dwarfing the plucky cowboy. Tex found himself staring at the Russian's navel, when a slow scrape thud, signifying Davenport's arrival, could be heard. Things now moved very fast. Boris was momentarily distracted by the new arrival, and in the twinkling of an eye, Tex scrambled up onto the shoulders of the referee and swung a massive right hook to where he calculated the Russian's chin to be, for it was obscured by his thick black beard. Fortune smiled on Tex that hot August night, and his punch found its mark. Tex fondly remembered the boxing lessons of his youth, given him by Father Brennan, the Jesuit middleweight champion, as Boris Tchaikovsky, the Russian bear, sank to his knees, utterly vanquished. And this would be the end of our tale, except for the occurrence of a singularly propitious event. When Davenport arrived and rescued Tex from becoming borscht, he took a seat next to the dastardly Wild Bill Skittle. All went well until Wild Bill, without thinking, stubbed out his cigar on Davenport's carved ivory prosthetic limb. All hell broke loose when the normally placid Davenport retaliated. Plunge in charcoal. Faces the group of trustees like a mountebank gulling his public. Philip long ago learned the value of theatricality in business while a blue button in the old Outcry Stock Exchange. He watched brokers and jobbers crying out, gesticulating, and dancing to the rhythm of magma chambers of money moving around the world, and has been using these skills to assault the financial markets ever since. Today, as always, he allows his voice to rise and fall as he paces the chamber, presenting his skullduggery vis-à-vis the Esperance Foundation as a fait accompli. Having outlined the firmness of his claim to the Esperance fortune, and saying that it is now only a matter of hours until he has the documents in his hands that shall deliver said fortune, he turns to face the trustees and changes tack. The trustees look concerned to the point of desperation, agitated, as Plunge becomes quietly reassuring, and in a soothing voice advises them to wind up any business they may have outstanding, and prepare to be turned out. Plunge's quiet venom hangs in the air of the chamber for some minutes after he has left, as the trustees reflect upon his extraordinary tirade. At last Palfreyman, the trust secretary, stands and addresses the trustees. I have been preparing for this eventuality since I first heard rumours of this scheme, and to that end I've been in touch with His Grace. There is an incoherent murmur of questions, which is made cogent by Hartley, the senior trustee. You have seen Toynbee?
Yes, I found him and asked him to help, and he has agreed. I believe he may have found a flaw in Plunge's plan.
Hartley again.
I had understood that he had turned his back on the trust and wanted no part of it. That is so, but when I apprised him of the scheming of Philip Luca, he agreed to help. It seems they were at school together, where they developed a mutual hatred which still persists.
The story so far. It was full 30 ells to the other side of the clearing, where stood the mirthful monk. The monk's eyes twinkled as he sized up Tex. A warning sounded somewhere in Tex's head as he returned the cleric's steady gaze. This was a delicate situation. Tricky, Cuban heel, now Gloria, would have called it, had she the power of speech. Tex was often grateful that Cuban heel was only a horse. Brother Philip, for it was he, called in a low, clear voice.
Howdy, partner. You're a mighty long way from the sea.
Now the two antagonists began to circle one another warily, each watching for an opening. Suddenly the opening presented itself to Tex. A little door in an oak tree, and a kind-hearted but sultry voice inviting him in. Brother Philip, for it was still he, looked around the clearing suspiciously. Where had the rangy Texan gone? The greensward was devastatingly empty. Suddenly, the sun glinted on the point of a halberd at the edge of the clearing, and Brother Philip heard a deep Russian voice declare,
All right, company, this is a good space. Warm-up exercises first.
A dispirited band of men and women, in shabby tights and jerkins, shuffled into the clearing, followed by a tall, imposing ballet master, known to choreographers the world over as Mighty Shay. Yes, it was another fabled man mountain, this one working in conjunction with the impresario of the DSS, Davenport Willard. Currently, Mighty is conducting dance therapy for long-term unemployed. Author's note, it is not widely known that the great danseur, Innocenti Isolzin, was an unemployed gasfitter before joining the corps de ballet at Kiev. The wily monk's narrow eyes narrowed as he regarded the ballet master narrowly. Could this be the same Mighty Shay with whom he had gone through the seminary at Vladivostok? The same mischievous imp who had hung the elderly abbot up by his heels in the bell tower? He looks again. No, it couldn't be. Could it? And indeed it wasn't. The two had never met. Meanwhile, inside the tree, Tex was short on a sense of humour, especially where interior design was concerned. Ruby had decorated the tree herself, with minimalist chrome fittings from Arboritat against a blinding white background, the starkness leavened by touches of leather luxury.
How will you handle this, babe?
Oh, I don't know. When Polframan first came to me, I said it would help, but I didn't know how.
Well, what do you normally do if you have a problem?
Oh, I don't know. I just sort of think about it until I get the answer.
Do you do anything special? Go anywhere?
Well, no, not really. Oh, yes, hang on. I go down to the library.
The library?
No, not the local one. I go to the family library.
Well, that is what you must do, my love.
For absolutely no reason. It was Bat Masterson, the legendary paediatrician and gunslinger, latterly a road manager and rock promoter. In fact, it was Masterson who persuaded Innocenti Isolzin to take up ballet while he was in Kiev on tour with the now-defunct punk Marxist band Pillow Biters from Hell. Readers will remember that the band broke up after the death of Cutter Stiles, the lead singer, in a grain silo, as the result of a mysterious accident that involved a vole. Sadly, Bat never recovered from this mischance. Well, of course, Innocenti has gone on to become one of the world's premier gasfitters. With one bound, Baby Howard looks up soulfully at his younger brother. Toynbee gazes back intently. How the hell did he get the eyeliner on? Suddenly the door opened, revealing Tiffany, and she very upset.
That's Barbie's frock,
she screeched.
Your friend is wearing Barbie's dress.
He is your brother, Tiff.
gentle Toynbee.
Well, I've never seen him before,
said through narrowed eyes. Tiffany's skill as a ventriloquist is well known to the family. And we've never seen you before, squeaked Baby Howard. I only know about you because I've been sharing Barbie's wardrobe for a couple of years. Toynbee is stunned. The thought died before it reached his lips, for he heard the rustle of a kimono in the corridor, the old Duke in transit to the lavatory. From Toynbee's pocket, where he had been placed for safety on the arrival of Tiffany, Baby Howard continues, Tiffany mutely immersed in redressing Barbie. One forgets she's only 5. Self-possessed, but damaged. It has not been easy. No, not just being gay. Toynbee looks blank. How many 3-inch tall homosexuals do you think there are? Well, anyway, it's not just the homosexual thing. Being with my own gender sexually is not as important as being a woman. And by the way, I'm not a woman trapped in a man's body. You see, I react to women as a man. Women turn me on. It's wearing frocks, being treated as a woman, perceived as a woman. That turns me on too. It's a buzz for me, but it's a man's buzz. The experience of being a woman gives me an erection. And that is a male thing. Do you understand, bro? Women are sexy. I find women sexy. Women's things. Do you understand? Toynbee is confused. Incontinently heterosexual all his life. The boy is nonplussed. This is well beyond his experience. Trying to make the pieces fit, he says, So, you're not gay? Of course I'm gay. I have to be. I need it all. Baby Howard, seeking some sign of recognition. Sadly unavailable. You still don't see it, do you? Oh, for Christ's sakes, bro, what do you expect? I walk in here, you're wearing a frock, and now you're asking me not just to understand, but to have some insight as well. Be reasonable, my voice is only just broken. Tiffany has finished applying underclothes to Barbie, and is now trying to extract Baby Howard from Toynbee's pocket, the better to retrieve Barbie's frock. The fracas is interrupted by the ducal voice, calling to Dubbo in the garden. It must be remembered that Baby Howard is the only sibling to have had a mother, Tiffany having been discovered in a locked drawer in a bureau secretaire at one of the better auction rooms, and Toynbee, Viscount Yackandander, coughed up on a sea of Armagnac. The tableau ever before Toynbee, Baby Howard, blooded from his first encounter with life, seeking the nipple, which was to prove his second. Palpable shit, piped Baby Howard. I know for a fact that voice broke to the sound of dropping gonads this 3 years since come Michaelmas, and you have been exacting your revenge upon unsuspecting members of the nobility ever since. Meanwhile, far from the rainforests of North London. I reiterate, my son, the world is composed of candles and moths. The candles throw out all the light, and the moths flutter about trying to get close to the flame. Sometimes the moths fly too close and are consumed. 'Tis a bright flame, but very brief. We could do with a candle in here, thought Toynbee. But no, moths cannot become candles, although when they fly too close to the flame they are consumed. Ergo, for one brief moment they resemble a candle, like Hitler, the arch-moth. On the other hand, you have Christ's bright flame, prematurely extinguished by the multitude. You see, candles don't become moths, strictly speaking, but sometimes the flame blows out or dies away before the candle is finished, and it ceases to give out light. Here the old Duke stopped and looked out the window. On the veldt, where the hearty beast is very hearty. With one bound, Baron van der Merwe sat heavily in the club chair, turning the assegai over and over in his hands. It was a long time before anyone spoke. Finally, the silence was broken by the Okapi. I once knew an eland, he said in broken English. A reaction ran around the room like a net curtain in summer. Sort of floppy and lethargic. Never trust abstainers and mystics, the brutal Baron suddenly exclaimed. "I never trust a man who doesn't drink, because there is something deeply suspicious about a reality which does not require modification. And as for mystics, they regard only their navels because the size of their bellies prevents contemplation of their penises, the only proper thing for consideration." A murmur of assent jogged around the room, a bit like the aforementioned net curtain, only faster. The Okapi saying, "Hear, hear." A lazy tropical breeze fought its way into the chamber, and a solitary gnu could be heard singing a jaunty song. Without warning, the door to the library swung open, and there stood Robin, flanked by his amused band. "We meet at last, Baron van der Merwe," hissed Robin with a contemptuous sneer. Always the gentleman, despite his Belgian education, the Baron stood, extending his hand in welcome. "So it's come to this," breathed the Okapi to himself. Hooligan, the social worker, who had been strumming a popular tune on his lute, now stepped forward abreast of Robin. After the abortive attempted lynching of Tex, Hooligan, who had narrowly missed having his throat slit, turned to a less dangerous occupation and, in partnership with Gloria, the born-again Palomino, had opened a collection agency. Gloria, of course, was in charge of sorting the catgut. However, in a disused corner of Bloomsbury, the last of the red-hot lavas, Bennett Dubois adjusted his underpants thoughtfully. His reputation as a retired ogre was at stake. Something in the chintz stirred, and with one bound, Ruby gazed up into the dark, brooding eyes of the stranger, while her heart fluttered a little. Arrhythmia had always been a problem in her family. It was just her luck for it to start happening now, just when the storm clouds were lifting from her life and the future looked secure. Ruby leaned forward attentively as the stranger with the troubled eyes and the finely chiselled features spoke for the first time.
"Well, Miss Lunch, everything appears to be in order here, and I see no reason why your loan should not be approved."
Here he paused, looking deeply into Ruby's eyes. She felt that he could see her very soul, or at least a faint light filtering in from her ears. That reminded her she needed to buy more cotton buds, and then continued, the words tumbling one after another.
"Unless there's something you haven't told me."
Ruby's breathing had become shallow, but the stranger appeared not to notice the effect he was having on her. For the first time, the gun in her shoulder holster felt uncomfortable. The hardness of the smoothly polished metal felt totally alien to her. She felt more alone than ever before in her sweet, young, confused, and exciting life. The moment was broken by the arrival of one of the tellers. It was the one called Igor, the one with a limp. He spoke, if it could be called speech.
"Will you be taking tea or coffee this morning, master?"
But the stranger was preoccupied with his own thoughts. He was in a land far away, engaged in a spitting competition with two raw-boned farm boys, and he was losing. Distractedly, he replied, Seemingly satisfied with this punctilious reply, Igor limped from the room. Ruby had never known such rupture, and, as the door closed behind the misshapen teller, she sighed.
"You could be master of all you surveyed."
"My fate?" queried the stranger, looking up suddenly. "Anything," Ruby breathed. She studied the stranger's large, strong hands, the firm, decisive way in which he filled in the loan contract, the little flourish as he filled in the annual rate. But in this moment of eternity, Ruby knew that she would never see this stranger again. But of course, she never, for a moment, suspected the nature of the extraordinary adventures that were to befall her. Somewhere in space. With one bound, Quattle, for it was he, turned to the bosun of the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod which was their spacecraft.
"Leave the Palomino alone,"
he barked. And, as if stung, the bosun leapt away. Gloria tossed her head impetuously as Ottelcue, for it was another he, skipped back to his seat behind the console.
The door to the bridge slid back, revealing Twelko, the cook.
"How many for dinner tonight, Captain?"
he quizzed. It was Igor who now spoke, if it could be called speech. It sounded like he said,
"I want you and a copy."
Twelko nodded wisely and retired. In the fashionable West End of Ronnie's mind, or maybe it's Toynbee's mind. Come to that, it could be hooligans, or Doc Skittles, or any number of people. To be honest, I couldn't say who actually has responsibility. I need to buy words desperately, so I go to the London office of Booze and Milne, the colonial wordery in Great Weasel Street. As I pass Fortnum's, the charming 18th century facade of the wordery comes into view. A reassuring sight. The familiar tinkling of the bell heralds my arrival. Once inside, I stand for a moment, becoming accustomed to the gloom of the establishment. The gloomiest part of the shop approaches me. It is Padbury, dear old Padbury, who's been here, man and boy. Padbury, who served old Sam Johnson as a lad, who slipped parcels in plain wrappers to Afra Ben.
"It's young Miss..."
Yes, Padbury, it is I.
"And how may I help you today, sir?"
Well, I don't know, Padbury. I just thought I'd have a little browse first. I'm actually looking for some adjectives. Maybe some descriptive phrases. You know the sort of thing.
Indeed, I do, sir. Nothing too flowery, if I remember right, sir.
That's right, Padbury.
Graphic and perhaps a little satanic. Ah, yes, sir. We'll doubtless have what you're after over there in the diabolic corner. You'll know where everything is, won't you, sir? It's always a pleasure to attend to gentlemen like yourself. These days everyone is in such a hurry. All these advertising persons, modern Irish writers and the like.
Here he leans against the counter, looking very tired.
We had that mighty shy fellow in here only yesterday, looking for alliterative descriptive phrases he was. No punctuation, no grammar.
Here he trails off, but I make no reply. He looks at me and raises one eyebrow, then sits abruptly on the floor, back to the counter, and legs splayed out before. Thinking he's gone to sleep, I turn to the diabolic corner. But he speaks again.
We had young Viscount Jackandanda in this morning, sir. What a nice young man he is.
Here he blows me a kiss.
Looking for a gift he was, sir, for one of his servants. Nothing too elaborate, so I put him in the way of some pronouns. Nice and simple, you understand. Plenty of integrity. Lovely manners he has. A real gentleman.
Padbury now loosens his wing collar and starts to undo the buttons of his fly. His eyelids droop as I step towards the diabolic corner.
Oh, of course, we stock all that new stuff for the advertising people. The very latest available. But it makes no never mind. They still take it away and cut it all up with knives, change the meaning, and all sorts. I don't mind telling you, sir, I take no pleasure selling it.
I hear him gently snoring as I begin truffling through the diabolic section. Aconite, amanita, banewort, death cup, ergo, jimson weed, corn cackle, bearded darnel, jacility, gastrolobium, monkshood, curare, upas, datura.
He's at Outlands, sir. Fine school down in Berkshire. Old Dr. Skittle, our founder, was at Outlands, you know, sir. But that was before the war.
I wonder idly which war he refers to. The War of Jenkins' Ear, perhaps? Death camas, henbane, hemlock, selenium. Padbury has fallen asleep with his collar awry, his hand on his cock. Hellish,
fiendish, impish, Mephistophelian, Alcluti, Shaitan, Phantom Wraith, Shade, Gremlin.
He's the son of the old Duke of Esperance, you know, sir. Very old family, Esperance. Young Rackandanda is the last one. Oh, there are rumours of an older brother, but you know how people love to talk.
He fell asleep, finally, farting. Meanwhile, near the steamy Sahara, Baron van der Merwe passed the field glasses to Robin, their ancient grudge forgotten. The two chums are now the best of friends. Some of Robin's jocular travelling companions sit nearby, still chuckling over the new scientist. Robin turns petulantly to silence them before they startle the herd of bus conductors that is grazing not 30 metres away. The Baron winks at Robin and whispers close to his ear. The Baron's, not Robin's. Boris Tchaikovsky. The Sylvan adventurer nods in agreement while focusing his pentax. No easy task. However, at the circus, Baby Howard is very excited. For the first time ever, he is to be allowed to be alone in the cage with the lions. The noble animals seem to know what is expected of them, and wait patiently in their places. None of their usual shy-acting and exuberant high spirits today. Even Neville, the biggest of the lions, who's eaten one strong man, a tightrope walker, and several small children, is strangely subdued. For these normally ferocious beasts have come to love Baby Howard, the gentle stripling who taught them the meaning of quality time, with his tales of particle physics, grand unified theory, and dark matter. Neville himself understood more clearly the nature of a naked singularity than at any time in his life. Yes, they were looking forward to today, these savage beasts, and Baby Howard knew no fear as he entered the cage, for he had come to love them as they him. It was going to be a doddle. Marco, the head trainer, watched his ward proudly as the boy cracked his whip and the lions responded nimbly. Well, all that is except Arthur, who had a hernia. Even old Arthur struggled valiantly to go through his paces, but his supporter was very constricting. All good things must end, however, and finally Baby Howard steps from the cage, leaving the lions to their stretching exercises. Marco spoke. "You done good, boy. I very pleased what you done today. You don't taking bullshit from Neville. That's good. And I never seen Arthur work like what he done for you. I very pleased. I gonna speak Mr. LeMessurier. Maybe we get you in the ring soon." Baby Howard was almost beside himself with joy. I say almost because, well, obviously it's not possible for someone to actually be beside themselves. Anyway, he was pretty chuffed and turning to Marco replied, "Super." With one bound, life goes on a chilly August morning, somewhere south of the Burlington Arcade. Pandemonium reigns supreme at the end of Great Weasel Street. The cabbie has never known a traffic jam like it and mutters something about Maastricht as he inches forward. The cause of the traffic hold-up was the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod of the spacecraft in the centre of the road outside Booz and Milne. Unfortunately, Quattle, for it was he, had angle-parked his long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod, as they do on Alpha Centauri. All traffic was at a standstill, as the petite green rover conferred with Padbury.
"More, sir?"
inquired the ancient word merchant of his exiguous green guest. Placing his hand on Padbury's forehead, Quattle indicated that he was becoming a little Brahms and Liszt, and anyway he was driving. Padbury looked at Quattle with new respect, for this show of self-discipline was a revelation to him. He had always thought of the interstellar travellers as celestial hippies. Before long, a young constable entered the premises of Booz and Milne to inquire about the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod, blocking the street, and maybe pick up some cheap words. Corris, for it was the very same, quickly established ownership of the craft and, seeing glasses in the two finagler's hands in a trice-produced a breathalyzer bag. His mistake was to insist upon Quattle blowing into the bag.
which the obliging alien immediately did. The effect was akin to defenestration of the City of London. Quattle explained to Padbury later, in the comfort of the officers' mess aboard the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod, that it was fortunate he was not drinking whisky, which had resulted in a supernova on one memorable occasion. Of course, as the reader very well knows, inter-star system rugby finals can become very rowdy affairs. Quattle could hardly be blamed for his boyish high spirits. On the other side of a world which no longer contains London. Ruby was saddened by the news that her hometown no longer existed. She read about it in the Daily Truffle, a major Australian newspaper, published by a major Australian. Nevertheless, life goes on. She must prepare herself for the concert. Tonight was going to be the realization of her life's dream. Tonight she will be singing background vocals for Tex Ace and his rhythm banditos. After the disastrous conclusion to her cheap, sordid affair with Frankie, Ruby decided to make a new life for herself on the other side of the world. She packed her pathetic bundle of belongings and embarked upon the biggest adventure of her life. On arrival in the great southern land, Ruby espoused an entirely fresh lifestyle, joining Cutter Styles and the Stylettes. As it turned out, her years in the civil service stood her in good stead. It was Ruby's chance meeting with Barry, which led to a chance meeting with Davenport Willard, and in turn to a passing encounter with the legendary Bat Masterson. As luck would have it, Bat was looking for backup singers for his new tour. Ruby and the kids leapt at the chance. Ruby pursed her full, sensuous, long, gleaming, throbbing lips as she reread the last paragraph concerning the mysterious and instant disappearance of London. Tex looked up from his hearty breakfast of kippers and maple syrup. Something was obviously troubling the little English gal, but what the heck, a fella has to concentrate when eating kippers. The bones can be hell, although the maple syrup had helped. The vole sat idly surveying the scene and picking his teeth. He was going to buy himself a grain silo of his very own when he'd made enough money out of this business. Meanwhile, Tex woke with an unaccountable longing for kippers. This was puzzling for the cowboy adventurer, since he had no idea what a kipper might be. Please insert your drawing of an Australian kipper, great white, in the space provided above. Attention. I'm taking control of this story. Ronnie Quest has shown herself to be unreliable and irresponsible. For starters, there's no goddamn narrative through line. Secondly, there's too many goddamn characters. I, for one, have never had to work with so many people. And there's a feeling amongst most of us here that a number of these so-called characters are totally unnecessary. I mean, for Christ's sake, what's a goddamn spaceman doing in this story? Ronnie? All right. Ms. Quest. All right, just shut up, will ya? Miss Quest, okay? Anyway, Miss Quest. What the hell was I saying? Oh, yeah, Miss Quest is obviously not fit to take charge of anybody's destiny. Yeah, right, not even her own. So we had a meeting about it, and we've decided to remove her and get some order back into the goddamn story. First off, the spaceman walks, and take your goddamn throbbing pub with you. There's damn all room back here anyway without all your goddamn hardware. Don't give me that wide-open prairie bullshit. We've been friggin' around in England in some goddamn limey boarding school for months. Just get your little green buddies the hell out of here. Yeah, give me the creeps. Oh, yeah, and before you go, put London back. What the hell do you mean you can't? Jesus H. Christ, it's a whole goddamn town. Now put it back. That's better. Now, vamoose, go on, scram. Somebody wake the old guy up. He's snoring. Yeah? Well, I can't smell anything. It sounds like snoring to me, bub. I need a cigarette. Somebody give me a cigarette. What? Don't give me that smoke-free environment pig shit. Come on, all you cowpoke smoke. I've seen you. Aha, very funny. Very, very funny. How the hell am I gonna roll one? What do these look like to you, huh? That's right, Buster. They're whose. Just go down and roll me one and stick it in there. Yeah, in the holder. Shut up, Tex. Oh, shit, now the other old dude started. What do you mean he's having a heart attack? Christ, Ronnie, do something. Get a doctor in here. On the open road, Dr. Derek Phoenix eased the old Austin Healey into fourth and let the old girl just tool along.
Soon be in Berkshire, old girl, Derek called above the whine of her precision motor. He'd never got over the thrill of letting her have her head on the open road. Suddenly, Derek noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Yes, there, behind that copse, a UFO was taking off. With the split-second reactions born of long years as a GP, Derek pulled into the side of the road and observed the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod as it rose vertically to a height of 1,000 feet and then veered off to the north at a speed of 5,000 kilometers per second. Show off. He couldn't be sure, but Derek fancied he saw a little green arm waving at one of the portholes in the side of the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod. Valet, Quattle. Adios, little buddy. Nowhere much.
Oh, dearie me, what a mess. That interfering horse has ruined months of work.
Still on the open road. With one bound, Derek sat and thought about what he had just seen. What was it? Could it have anything to do with the correspondence he'd been reading in the Daily Truffle, a journal he had airmailed from Australia daily? Of late, it had contained letters from a Palomino to the editor concerning extraterrestrials, which had inspired more letters from Ronnie Quest, the eminent author. The correspondence in question had finally become quite vitriolic, having to do with caustic speech, criticism, feeling, etc., from the Old French via Latin vitriolum, vitrum glass. Ronnie Quest is back. Keep watching. Padbury leered off into the night, winking and farting. Just before he and his crew had been ejected without ceremony by the lovely Palomino, Quattle had taken the boys out for a night of nameless pleasure in Stockholm. Of course, they went to a singles bar and caused quite a stir in their uniforms. It was at the Lonely Condom, formerly the Estrogen Bar, that Quattle laid most of his eyes on Ulla. It was love at first sight for the two young people. None of the girls on Quattle's home planet had blonde hair. At least not genuine blonde hair. The little green space ranger had always had a marked preference for matching collar and cuffs. Green hair, green pubes. And he was transported by the sight of the statuesque Nordic beauty, just prior to being transported in a more literal sense by the lovely Palomino. Quattle also liked matching teeth and eyes like the women at home, but somehow he didn't feel that magenta teeth would look any good. Ulla didn't want to just live with him. She insisted on marriage. Ottelque was the best man. In a condominium on Alpha Centauri, Ulla gazed through half-closed eyes at her eyelashes, which were so thick they obscured everything else. It was no good. She had to open her eyes wide in order to see her heart's desire.
Quattle I am, and Quattle remain, for it is I. Ha ha!
If it could be called laughing.
I am returned, for the I-ness of me is indomitable, irresistible, inevitable.
And a fine, gentle person you are too, sir, if I may be so bold.
Darling, how long is Padbury going to be staying with us?
Down to the library. Toynbee goes in search of the solution to the problem of plunge. Frankly, he's not too hopeful, but he did tell Mr. Palfreyman that he would help. Once inside the chamber, he hears the usual murmur of voices, and he approaches the pit in hopes of gaining some insight.
There is a problem, my son.
Oh, yes, Father, there is. It seems that someone is trying to take control of the Esperance Foundation to gain access to the family fortune.
Yes, my boy, I knew this day would come.
It seems that there is a person who has papers that establish him as the heir to the Esperance fortune, but that is not the problem. It is the fact that he is in the control of another man who is a very bad person.
We know him, Philip Plunge. The irony is that this Florence Block person, who is claiming to be a dupe, is actually descended indirectly from the other branch of the family.
So you know about Florence, then?
Yes, we've been expecting it since the trouble with Grendel.
Grendel?
You know him as Bennett. But you see, Florenz does not know that he has a genuine claim. No, he must do that which is necessary to rectify this situation. Go and search among the things here in the library until you find a clock. When you have it, return to the pit and I shall instruct you further. It is a clock in a walnut case that used to sit upon the mantelpiece in the study. I do not know where it is exactly, so you must search for it. We have a little time, but not unlimited, so do not dally.
Toynbee sets off in search of the clock. He tries to be quick, but careful, examining everything. Still, life goes on. Derek Phoenix had never held so much money in his hot, sweaty hands before. He never suspected that there could be this much money in the world. Remember that these were the same hot, sweaty hands that had made him such a success as a GP. But for all his success, he had never dreamed of such riches. There was a slight cough from the corner. Yes, it was that miscreant, that dastardly Wild Bill Skittle. Wild Bill's black eyes smouldered in his head as he regarded the venal doctor. I am beset on all sides by human nature in its worst forms. My partner is a disgustingly degenerate ex-DSS officer, whose excesses are exceeded only by the actions of our most senior employee, a no-account squid. So you see we need each other. Just a moment, old bean. I don't actually know the two Johnnies you speak of, but are they part of a different bit of the story? Where did you get those shiners? Derek wondered idly if perhaps the saloon keeper had mistaken him for someone else. After all, Derek had never even heard of this DSS officer before, or the squid. Wild Bill walked slowly around the Austin Healey, kicking the tires. He didn't take his eyes off Derek once as he did so. Suddenly, Derek exploded. After the smoke cleared, "Look, old bean, I'd rather you didn't do that," he said quietly, indicating the motor car. The time it takes Toynbee to find the clock which he has been sent for ages him 30 years. He returns with it to the pit for further instructions. His father asks if the clock is going. No, it is not, and Toynbee gives it a little shake.
What are you doing, lad?
Well, it's not going, so I gave it a little shake.
No, you must wait for the right moment, and then you must wind the clock. But not until the moment, I tell you.
How shall I wind it, Father?
Did you not see a key?
Toynbee looks inside the case and all over the clock, but can see nothing.
It is most important that you wind the clock at the precise moment that I say, not a moment before, nor a moment later.
Why, sir?
I shall explain when the time comes, but first you must locate the key. There is not much time remaining. Check the case again. I shall explain when the time comes, but first you must locate the key. There is not much time remaining.
Checking the case again, Toynbee discovers that one corner seems to be loose and tries to manipulate it, hoping that it is a concealed drawer or compartment. In fact, it is the spring which releases a hidden drawer on the other side of the case, which contains the key. The time it takes him to cross the threshold of the colonial wordery ages him 30 years. Padbury looks up and informs our hero of the letter from his brother, Baby Howard, for it was he, had written from another exotic location. Our rapidly aged, although previously young hero, can hear the soft whinny of a lovely palomino in the distance.
Come to that, we can all hear that infernal horse.
However, down among the Burkes, Toynbee adjusts the position of the shirt upon his head, casually, so as not to disturb Mr. Padbury. I met Shirley by accident, really. She was in the department's production of The Frogs. Stoppard interrupts and Padbury replies, Dear me, no, I told you she was a stripper. Ecdysiast is the proper name.
from the Greek ekdousis via Latin, meaning casting off of an outer shell. Best legs I've ever seen on a frog. And when she went brekikex, coax, my blood ran hot and cold. Sadly, boys, she was just another moth with the characteristics of a candle. Exultantly, Florenz and Eddie march along Arder Street at 5 in the morning. Both are slightly drunk and extremely euphoric because they have been with the Duke of Esperance all night and are now in possession of the legal paper which gives Florenz a clear prior claim on the Esperance fortune. With the backing of Viscount Plunge, they can establish Florenz's lineage and thus sequester the funds of the Esperance Foundation at a stroke. Downtown, Davenport looked carefully at Bat. There were times when he questioned the wisdom of turning his back on the DSS and going into the music business with the old gunslinger. But then he'd never had as much money before, and there was the distinct possibility of something developing with Gloria. Who could tell in the wacky world of rock and roll? Looking at his watch, the aging desperado informed Davenport that the car would soon arrive to pick them up. Davenport had never been as sweet and vulnerable as he was at this moment. Now came the part of his work that the young ex-DSS officer disliked intensely. Nevertheless, he dragged his unwilling feet across to the corner of the room, where Tex lay in a drunken stupor. Bat was already at the lean Texan's side, struggling to rouse him, as Davenport bent down to assist. Tex opened his eyes. "My, but you're looking dang vulnerable tonight, partner." Accustomed to Tex's casual pleasantries, Davenport merely said, "And you're looking a mite rangy, little buddy." The cowboy scrambled to his feet. "Why, so I am." He turned to face the two entrepreneurs. "Gloria wants to join the act. Things ain't working out with Hooligan," he said without preamble. It was Bat who broke the awful silence. "I never trusted that social worker. He was too clever by half. A mischievous little chap if ever I saw one. However, I know I'm a moth too, but as you very well know, moths rarely want other moths. They want candles, but that wasn't the problem. It was the thought of my bathroom becoming a rainforest of drying stockings. I just could not surrender my privacy, while Shirley surrendered hers nightly." Toynbee was trying to imagine the privacy to be had halfway up a chalk cliff. Actually, I was very proud of her. She was very beautiful. Simultaneously, in a celestial council chamber. "We are very disappointed in you, Quattle. Very. You will have to explain this concept to us again. Are you asking us to believe that these earthlings remain only in one persona, either as a giver or receiver of seed, and only in pairs?"
Yes, sir.
"Forgive me, Quattle, but why did you undertake to embrace this extraordinary and barbaric earth business of marriage?"
She's got great knockers, sir.
"But you don't even speak Swedish, you silly little galactic freebooter." Coming down to earth. Slowly, the cable winched upwards. All hands followed its progress toward the crow's nest. There was a chorus of oohs and ahs as the plain chocolate digestive, attached to the end of the cable, swung to and fro in the stiff breeze. This was the third attempt to get a biscuit up to the lookout this morning. Everything depended on the success of this bold move. Just after the war, Dr. Phoenix removed the bulky RAF flying jacket, which was hampering his movements somewhat, as he attended the heart attack victim, Esperance. In the distance could be heard a solitary mew, or was it an okapi? Derek hummed along with the animal under his breath, and his patient joined in on the choruses, vainly attempting harmony despite the pains in his chest. Toynbee stands anxiously, watching from the safety of the wash basin, as the mild-mannered medico and motor mechanic worked skillfully to restore life to the penultimate Duke of Esperance. Detention continues. Men have been tampering with immortality since time began, and they finally got close. They have invented little Pyrex babies. The arts have been sufficient to sate the lust for immortality until now, but with more women invading the arts successfully, men had to find a way to fight back. I bet you can't think of too many female geneticists, can you, Stoppard, old son? Of course they're in there. Oh yes, they're in there absolutely pissing themselves, because they know you don't need all those surgical spanners to create life. They know a much better way. We've been looking for the meaning of life all this time, and they always had it. Life is the meaning of life. To exist. Sum ergo cogito. Poor old Rene had it arse about. And poor old Toynbee wished very much that he was with Rene, wherever he might be. This is definitely scary. Back in the chintz again, Ruby fiddled nervously with the stuffed cat around her throat as she took another mouthful of pie floater. These peas are wonderful, she reflected. With great perspicacity, Barry passed her the tomato sauce. You know Gloria's going to join the act, the squid said, through a mouthful of food. We have to let her. Tex is calling the shots. Ruby had never known such sadness. In a celestial pleasure pit, although not all of Quattle's penises was actually erect, Ulla had never known such pleasure. Somewhere a squid stirred. However, at Outlands, so I went out to Australia because of Nigel, one of the blokes I was at Oxford with. He went out there when he didn't get his degree, and he kept writing saying it was just like the Wild West and really exciting. But I couldn't stay there because I never felt I really belonged out there, so I came home after 10 months. Mind you, I never went to Melbourne, and they reckon that's more like London. Nigel never felt that comfortable either, but he'd made a reasonable life for himself, and he didn't feel he belonged back here either, so he stayed. And that's the funny thing about the place. Nobody looks as if they really belong there. The life there is sort of peripheral and clings desperately to the edges. All the big towns are on the coast, with the exception of Darwin, which has been situated as a first defence against cyclones. After 200 years, nobody's made much of a dent on the interior. Even the Aborigines seem sort of impermanent. At least they've been there 40,000 years, but they still look like they've just camped there and they'll move on someday. The European settlers are giving them every encouragement, it would seem. There's farms there, enormous farms, but they look so bloody desolate, and it's impossibly hard. Always droughts and floods and bushfires. But the Aussies cling on single-mindedly. Strange people. They also surf who only stand and wade. The jam that Barry had been stirring was starting to set. Back home, things were different for Ulla. No one spoke Swedish on this burning, forsaken planet, where it rained all the time. Quattle was changed. He'd become more green, and they no longer talked as much. She missed her friends. Detained. Somewhere Bennett could be heard laughing, and Toynbee was beginning to wish he was elsewhere. Maybe a run-down saloon on the outskirts of town. The night Ulla came home from shopping and found Quattle rutting.
All right, that's enough, Ronnie. I've had it with the goddamn green playboy and his Swedish bimbo. Cut the crap. This story's about me. Let's just get back to the fakakta business.
Now look here, Gloria. I let you change your name, my dear, and then I let you start using the cigarette holder, but I'm not going to let you turn this into my friend Flicker. If you were to break your leg, you would have to be shot. Do I make myself clear?
Don't you threaten me, you old painted trollop.
Trollope, no, I was a writer. I recall when old Dr. Skittle was alive.
If you try anything with me, we're all out of here. The Cowpokes, Wild Bill, Masterson, Willard, Mighty Shea, Boris Blackjack, they're all going to walk. You got that, Miss Quest?
Padbury was starting to get very tired of all this bickering. In the old days, everyone knew where they stood. If one was a character, one just did what was required of one by the story. And that was that. But with all these modern writers nowadays, a fellow doesn't know where he is. Padbury started years ago, just doing little extra pieces for one or two of the writers that came into Booze and Milne. Just to help out, really.
nothing that would interfere with his work at the wordery. He's still not sure how that dreadful Quest woman got onto him in the first place, but she had assured him in the strongest terms that he wouldn't have a great deal to do. Oh, it's all so disappointing. At least young Yak and Dander is a decent sort, a young man of real quality. It can't go on much longer now, surely. Toynbee trickled along happily. Our hero is in love and happy, and he has discovered the intensity of the lover's chiaroscuro. He has discovered that his emotions have become finite. There is no degree to his love. He is simply in love, and his life has been thrown into sharp relief by the darling Ruby. She may appear at any moment, grinning on the arm of a new, or maybe an okapi. So Toynbee treacles happily, and the years fall away from him as he remembers his first ever night of carnality at the hands of the darling Ruby. 52, 51, 50, and so on, back to the age of 45, where he's just happy to remain, his first ever night of carnality, for the young man was a virgin until meeting the darling Ruby. They went to Ruby's cold room with the interesting bits and pieces sprinkled among the disarray. Being there to fornicate, they undressed without preamble. After assaulted filth and tampering, Toynbee rolled over to insinuate himself between Ruby's thighs, and Ruby reached down easily to guide Toynbee's mighty bladder to the appropriate berth. Toynbee didn't move, but lay inside her, holding his breath. And why not? His penis was dissolving, melting into the flesh of the darling Ruby's vaginal wall. "Is this," Toynbee whispered, "is this what's supposed to happen?" He didn't remember this from the book his father had given him when he reached puberty. Even old Arthur had never mentioned it. "Am I doing it right, my love?" But answer came there none, for the darling Ruby was either asleep or thinking of something else. Toynbee ignored the sensation of pins and needles in his groin. Soon it was all gone, the mighty bladder being replaced by a fold of skin and a very tiny clitoris, which afforded substantial pleasure for Toynbee in later years. Afterwards they lay together and smoked a ham. Toynbee's previous education in the pleasures and responsibilities of the flesh had rested with Arthur Dubbo, he of the eldritch disposition. It had consisted of Arthur taking the young novitiate to observe the beasts of the field rutting. Toynbee thought it looked uncomfortable and painful. He had not realized that the sexes are designed to accommodate each other. Arthur took him for a closer look at the genitals of a ewe, pointed to Toynbee's penis, and saying between wheezy chuckles, "That goes in there, young master."
Toynbee was devastated, believing that he would have to copulate with sheep. Hence, for many years, he avoided the subject of carnality. I can remember her black eyes, driving the steam coming off her brain as I dive into the pitch pool of her soul. The last thing I saw was my white heels disappearing beneath the surface, and her perfect breast remains the motor of my desire. I'm now drunk to the point of capitulation.
"Ronnie!"
Go screw yourself, Gloria.
Life goes on still. The barman at McCool's, Miles, places the jar of porter before Saxophone, Clontarf's favourite musicologist. "A pint of plain, Miles, a rare thing, that," said as he raises the drink to his lips and his spirits with the glass. The eyes of the barman speak the laughter of his soul that escapes via his thick tongue. "Do you know what it is, Mr. Fine, that the Italian has his cappuccino when we here in Erin have the porter?" "It is true that I do not, Miles, you old flannel." And Miles smiles the smile of an initiator. "Well, the Italians had the first pick." The initiated acknowledges with a chuckle. He speaks, "I'm expecting a big day of it." But before Miles could answer, the door of the snug opened, admitting a Russian cleric. "Right, that's it, Ronnie. Enough is enough. I'm out of here right this goddamn minute. I didn't mind the Joycean pretensions, but this is pathetic. A Russian cleric?" Feeling her fetlock again, Tex shook his head sadly. A small quartz of sadness formed in the corner of one eye, the one without the squint. "Now, just a gold darn minute, little lady. What's all this baked beans about a squint?" The arrow found its mark in the small of Tex's back. He wouldn't even have heard it, and he slumped forward, lifeless, onto the body of his late horse. Perhaps it was the noise of the shot which attracted the Indians. We'll never know. The Indians didn't hang around. At any rate, Tex's features relaxed in death, giving him a rather quizzical look.
Excuse me, Miss Quest, but I hear you repeating yourself.
"Yes, you are," a chorus of damning agreement. Derek swerved wildly to avoid the charabanc coming towards him, and the driver of the bus took the same action. Unfortunately, the bus careered off the road and down the ravine beside it. Everyone was dead. It was a terrible scene of carnage. He tried to give the squid mouth-to-beak resuscitation, but it was no good. "Hang on a tick, old guy. It's just a bit thin, don't you think? I mean, after all, I'm a doctor, you know, saving chaps' lives." Derek never heard the filthy, sweaty pig creep up behind him. Gaston, pourquoi c'était lui-même, was skilled with the garrote. The Tour de France have struck again. With his finger on the key, Toynbee waits for the signal from his father to begin winding the clock. Florian and Edmund are staggering, hysterically euphoric with the enormity of what they have done and shall do next when they have returned to their own time. Toynbee looks at the pit.
"Father?" "Not quite yet, my boy, but any second now."
Florian and Edmund are now at the little door to the folly. Edmund enters first, and Florian immediately behind. At the precise moment that Florian crosses the threshold, Toynbee's father gives the instruction to wind, and he does. The mechanism of the clock starts to move, and time stops for Florian. He is trapped like a fly in amber. Toynbee's father now explains to him what has happened, that their problem is solved, and that the clock shall not require winding again. Toynbee may now pursue the life he sees as his. I've stopped talking to Doc Skittle about Quattle and the others. Well, I don't talk to them so much these days. I think the Doc gets a bit uptight if I mention Quattle. He ups my megadrax. I don't duck the medication, though, because if you do, they just take a specimen, and if it's not there, they give you even more. And that's worse than taking the shit they already give you. No, I'm just going to keep my nose clean, so I can get out of here as soon as possible, unless something happens sooner. I haven't even told him about Tex. What's that noise? And most of the nurses are so dumb. Like Hooligan. Sean Hooligan, a nurse among nurses. The death of Ignace, Duke of Esperance, was observed only by Annie Tepper, faithful to the last, and Hill Badger. The ultimate Duke of Esperance lies in his bed, visibly fading, becoming transparent. After a moment, the dying Duke speaks.
"Have you brought Hill to me, Annie?"
His eyes are not open, and he lacks the strength to open them. "Yes, Ignace, I brought your son."
"He must wheel me down to the pit."
"I remember, sir." "Do you, my boy?
"Do you? You're a good lad, and I'm truly sorry for the way I have treated you. However, you shall now be recompensed."
It was after the inexplicable disappearance of Florian and his little drunken friend that Ignace was reconciled with his bastard, largely due to the manipulations of Mistress Annie Tepper. Ignace had made no provision for his lifelong lover. In his final years, Annie had moved into the house with him and scandalized society. But her activity on behalf of Hill had led to an agreement between them, which in turn will lead to a very comfortable life for her.
"Annie, my love."
The old man is all but inaudible now.
"Yes, my love,"
she replies.
"Let me taste your divine tit one last time."
And so it was that Annie Tepper bared her breast and placed her nipple in the dying man's mouth. Hill was uncomfortable, not for the sight of Annie's bare breast, but rather for witnessing such intimacy.
His father expired with a tit in his mouth without speaking again. Hill had been left everything except the title, but this was soon rectified because, in fact, on the death of his father, he became the richest man in England. Richer even than the king, it was rumoured. The only other remnant of this episode, Eddie Valentine, may be found sleeping in doorways along Arder Street and talking gibberish about the fortune that slipped from his grasp to any who will listen. All nonsense, of course. The man's a crazed alcoholic. Hang on, it's getting closer. My doctor's a moron. He's locked off on some shitty trip of his own and just trying to make me fit into some preconceived notions of his. Doc Phoenix sort of explained what's going on with me. First of all, what I have is schizophreniform psychosis. Sounds good, innit? Doctor said it works like a newspaper photograph. My perception of reality is like an image made up of dots. Each dot is a little piece of information, and they all add up to an overall image. He says my neurons are the dots, and my system manufactures dopamine to link the dots up. Dopamine carries information between the neurons so that it can be processed. So we've all got this newspaper photo of reality in our heads. Of course, it's only true reality if you have all the dots operating, because if your endocrine system is out of whack, like mine was, you're not producing dopamine and upwards of 60% of your dots are missing at random. Then the chances are you're not getting a super clear picture. And that's when Bennett first contacted me. He told me about HUOS, the Human Unit Operating System. Now, I haven't told Phoenix or anyone about this because I figured that if they already knew about it, they would have told me. Bennett told me that the human brain functions like RAM, and DNA is the hard disk. All my basic survival instructions are built in on the hard disk, so I can still function as an animal, but if my RAM is shot, I can't function as a social animal. Now, I'm not really sure about this Bennett guy. Shit, that sounds really close now. Anyway, I don't trust any of them. They're creating poor sods who are going to be dependent upon the mental health system for the rest of their lives. But not me, Buster. Not yours truly. They're not getting me. That is very loud. Hang on. There's the long, gleaming, throbbing silver pod. It's Quattle. He's come to get me. I knew he'd come back. It has been some months now since Tex went, and Ruby is coping very well. She's even stopped taking the Megadrax, and she's getting on with her life. She's gone back to school in order to complete her degree in sultry saloon singing, and everything seems to be okay now. Quite tickety-boo. What you will I be handsome? Will I be rich? Ruby has a new beau, one of the cow-punchers from the bar Nothing, a mighty fine young man who seems to have serious intentions toward the little lady. He has been making a little extra in the way of spondoolies just lately by parleying with the proprietor of the Tumbleweed Times, which are the only newspaper and sole organ in these here parts. The proprietor, an ornery cuss by the name of Ambrose, is only recently arrived in these here parts, having been involved in some fracas down south with some Mexicans. Anyway, he's here now and running the newspaper. So this here cowpuncher I was speaking of, also Ambrose by name, has been given the other Ambrose information concerning the movement of cattle and such like, as well as writing reviews of the shows at the Plug Nickel. Of course, Ruby had to stop working at the TPN pronto because of conflict of interest, on account of her being sweet on this hombre that writes the reviews when he ain't punching cows. But it made no never mind, 'cause Ruby was about ready to settle up and move out anyway, having had a bellyful of sultry saloon singing in a practical sense. The end. An appendix. General appointments. Manageress required for London's oldest wordery. Experience and references essential. Salary negotiable. Apply sending CV to Jeremy Skittle, 19B, Great Weasel Street, London.